Studies in Pessimism by Arthur Schopenhauer. Unless suffering is the direct and immediate object of life, our existence must entirely fail of its aim. It is absurd to look upon the enormous amount of pain that abounds everywhere in the world, and originates in needs and necessities inseparable from life itself, as serving no purpose at all, and the result of mere chance. Each separate misfortune as it comes seems, no doubt, to be something exceptional, but misfortune in general is the rule. I know of no greater absurdity than that propounded by most systems of philosophy in declaring evil to be negative in its character. Evil is just what is positive. It makes its own existence felt. Leibniz is particularly concerned to defend this absurdity, and he seeks to strengthen his position by using a palpable and paltry sophism. Translator's note. Confer Theod, section 153. Leibniz argued that evil is a negative quality, i.e., the absence of good, and that its active and seemingly positive character is an incidental and not an essential part of its nature. Cold, he said, is only the absence of the power of heat, and the active power of expansion in freezing water is an incidental and not an essential part of the nature of cold. The fact is that the power of expansion in freezing water is really an increase of repulsion amongst its molecules, and Schopenhauer is quite right in calling the whole argument a sophism. End translator's note. It is the good which is negative. In other words, happiness and satisfaction always imply some desire fulfilled, some state of pain brought to an end. This explains the fact that we generally find pleasure to be not nearly so pleasant as we expected, and pain very much more painful. The pleasure in this world, it has been said, outweighs the pain, or at any rate, there is an even balance between the two. If the reader wishes to see shortly whether this statement is true, let him compare the respective feelings of two animals, one of which is engaged in eating the other. The best consolation in misfortune or affliction of any kind will be the thought of other people who are in a still worse plight than yourself. And this is a form of consolation open to everyone. But what an awful fate this means for mankind as a whole. We are like lambs in a field, disporting themselves under the eye of the butcher, who chooses out first one and then another for his prey. So it is that in our good days we are all unconscious of the evil fate may have presently in store for us: sickness, poverty, mutilation, loss of sight or reason. No little part of the torment of existence lies in this, that time is continually pressing upon us, never letting us take breath, but always coming after us, like a taskmaster with a whip. If at any moment time stays his hand, it is only when we are delivered over to the misery of boredom. But misfortune has its uses, for, as our bodily frame would burst asunder if the pressure of the atmosphere was removed, so, if the lives of men were relieved of all need, hardship, and adversity, if everything they took in hand were successful, they would be so swollen with arrogance that, though they might not burst, they would present the spectacle of unbridled folly, nay, they would go mad. And I may say, further, that a certain amount of care or pain or trouble is necessary for every man at all times. A ship without ballast is unstable, and will not go straight. Certain it is that work, worry, labor, and trouble form the lot of almost all men their whole life long. But if all wishes were fulfilled as soon as they arose, how would men occupy their lives? What would they do with their time? If the world were a paradise of luxury and ease, a land flowing with milk and honey, where every jack obtained his Jill at once and without any difficulty, men would either die of boredom or hang themselves, or there would be wars, massacres, and murders, so that, in the end, mankind would inflict more suffering on itself than it has now to accept at the hands of nature. In early youth, as we contemplate our coming life, We are like children in a theater before the curtain is raised, sitting there in high spirits and eagerly waiting for the play to begin. It is a blessing that we do not know what is really going to happen. Could we foresee it, there are times when children might seem like innocent prisoners, condemned not to death, but to life, and as yet all unconscious of what their sentence means. Nevertheless, every man desires to reach old age, in other words, a state of life of which it may be said, "It is bad today, and it will be worse tomorrow, and so on till the worst of all." If you try to imagine as nearly as you can what an amount of misery, pain, and suffering of every kind the sun shines upon in its course, you will admit that it would be much better if, on the earth as little as on the moon, the sun were able to call forth the phenomena of life, and if, here as there, the surface were still in a crystalline state. Again, you may look upon life as an unprofitable episode disturbing the blessed calm of non-existence, and, in any case, even though things have gone with you tolerably well, the longer you live, the more clearly you will feel that, on the whole, life is a disappointment, nay, a cheat. If two men who were friends in their youth meet again when they are old, after being separated for a lifetime, the chief feeling they will have at the sight of each other will be one of complete disappointment at life as a whole, because their thoughts will be carried back to that earlier time when life seemed so fair as it lay spread out before them in the rosy light of dawn, promised so much, and then performed so little. This feeling will so completely predominate over every other that they will not even consider it necessary to give it words, but on either side it will be silently assumed and form the groundwork of all they have to talk about. He who lives to see 2 or 3 generations is like a man who sits some time in the conjurer's booth at a fair and witnesses the performance twice or thrice in succession. The tricks were meant to be seen only once, and when they are no longer a novelty and cease to deceive, their effect is gone. While no man is much to be envied for his lot, there are countless numbers whose fate is to be deplored. Life is a task to be done. It is a fine thing to say, defunctus est. It means that the man has done his task. If children were brought into the world by an act of pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist? Would not a man rather have so much sympathy with the coming generation as to spare it the burden of existence, or at any rate, not take it upon himself to impose that burden upon it in cold blood? I shall be told, I suppose, that my philosophy is comfortless, because I speak the truth, and people prefer to be assured that everything the Lord has made is good. Go to the priest, then, and leave philosophers in peace. At any rate, do not ask us to accommodate our doctrines to the lessons you have been taught. That is what those rascals of sham philosophers will do for you. Ask them for any doctrine you please, and you'll get it. Your university professors are bound to preach optimism, and it is an easy and agreeable task to upset their theories. I have reminded the reader that every state of welfare, every feeling of satisfaction, is negative in its character. That is to say, it consists in freedom from pain, which is the positive element of existence. It follows, therefore, that the happiness of any given life is to be measured not by its joys and pleasures, but by the extent to which it has been free from suffering, from positive evil. If this is the true standpoint, the lower animals appear to enjoy a happier destiny than man. Let us examine the matter a little more closely. However varied the forms that human happiness and misery may take, leading a man to seek the one and shun the other, the material basis of it all is bodily pleasure or bodily pain. This basis is very restricted. It is simply health, food, protection from wet and cold, the satisfaction of the sexual instinct, or else the absence of these things. Consequently, as far as real physical pleasure is concerned, the man is not much better off than the brute, except in so far as the higher possibilities of his nervous system make him more sensitive to every kind of pleasure, but also, it must be remembered, to every kind of pain. But then, compared with the brute, how much stronger are the passions aroused in him? What an immeasurable difference there is in the depth and vehemence of his emotions. And yet, in the one case, as in the other, all to produce the same result in the end, namely health, food, clothing, and so on. The chief source of all this passion is that thought for what is absent and future, which, with man, exercises such a powerful influence upon all he does. It is this that is the real origin of his cares, his hopes, his fears. Emotions which affect him much more deeply than could ever be the case with those present joys and sufferings to which the brute is confined. In his powers of reflection, memory, and foresight, man possesses, as it were, a machine for condensing and storing up his pleasures and his sorrows. But the brute has nothing of the kind. Whenever it is in pain, it is as though it were suffering for the first time, even though the same thing should have previously happened to it times out of number. It has no power of summing up its feelings, hence its careless and placid temper. How much it is to be envied! But in man, reflection comes in, with all the emotions to which it gives rise, and taking up the same elements of pleasure and pain which are common to him and the brute, it develops his susceptibility to happiness and misery to such a degree that, at one moment, the man is brought in an instant to a state of delight that may even prove fatal, at another to the depths of despair and suicide. If we carry our analysis a step farther, we shall find that, in order to increase his pleasures, man has intentionally added to the number and pressure of his needs, which in their original state were not much more difficult to satisfy than those of the brute. Hence, luxury in all its forms, delicate food, the use of tobacco and opium, spirituous liquors, fine clothes, and the 1,001 things that he considers necessary to his existence. And above and beyond all this, there is a separate and peculiar source of pleasure and consequently of pain, which man has established for himself, also as the result of using his powers of reflection. And this occupies him out of all proportion to its value, nay, almost more than all his other interests put together. I mean ambition, and the feeling of honor and shame. In plain words, what he thinks about the opinion other people have of him. Taking 1,000 forms, often very strange ones, this becomes the goal of almost all the efforts he makes that are not rooted in physical pleasure or pain. It is true that besides the sources of pleasure which he has in common with the brute, man has the pleasures of the mind as well. These admit of many gradations, from the most innocent trifling or the merest talk up to the highest intellectual achievements. But there is the accompanying boredom to be set against them on the side of suffering. Boredom is a form of suffering unknown to brutes, at any rate in their natural state. It is only the very cleverest of them who show faint traces of it when they are domesticated, whereas in the case of man it has become a downright scourge. The crowd of miserable wretches whose one aim in life is to fill their purses, but never to put anything into their heads, offers a singular instance of this torment of boredom. Their wealth becomes a punishment by delivering them up to misery of having nothing to do. For to escape it, they will rush about in all directions, traveling here, there, and everywhere. No sooner do they arrive in a place than they are anxious to know what amusements it affords, just as though they were beggars asking where they could receive a dole. Of a truth, need and boredom are the two poles of human life. Finally, I may mention that as regards the sexual relation, a man is committed to a peculiar arrangement which drives him obstinately to choose one person. This feeling grows now and then into a more or less passionate love, which is the source of little pleasure and much suffering. It is, however, a wonderful thing that the mere addition of thought should serve to raise such a vast and lofty structure of human happiness and misery, resting, too, on the same narrow basis of joy and sorrow as man holds in common with the brute, and exposing him to such violent emotions, to so many storms of passion, so much convulsion of feeling, that what he has suffered stands written, and may be read in the lines on his face. And yet, when all is told, he has been struggling ultimately for the same things as the brute has attained, and with an incomparably smaller expenditure of passion and pain. But all this contributes to increase the measures of suffering in human life out of all proportion to its pleasures, and the pains of life are made much worse for man by the fact that death is something very real to him. The brute flies from death instinctively, without really knowing what it is, and therefore without ever contemplating it in the way natural to a man, who has this prospect always before his eyes. So that, even if only a few brutes die a natural death, and most of them live only just long enough to transmit their species, and then, if not earlier, become the prey of some other animal, whilst man, on the other hand, manages to make so-called natural death the rule, to which, however, there are a good many exceptions. The advantage is on the side of the brute, for the reasons stated above. But the fact is that man attains the natural term of years just as seldom as the brute, because the unnatural way in which he lives and the strain of work and emotion lead to a degeneration of the race, and so his goal is not often reached. The brute is much more content with mere existence than man. The plant is wholly so, and man finds satisfaction in it just in proportion as he is dull and obtuse. Accordingly, the life of the brute carries less sorrow with it, but also less of joy when compared with the life of man. And while this may be traced, on the one side, to freedom from the torment of care and anxiety, it is also due to the fact that hope, in any real sense, is unknown to the brute. It is thus deprived from any share in that which gives us the most and best of our joys and pleasures, the mental anticipation of a happy future, and the inspiriting play of fantasy, both of which we owe to our power of imagination. If the brute is free from care, it is also, in this sense, without hope. In either case, because its consciousness is limited to the present moment, to what it can actually see before it. The brute is an embodiment of present impulses, and hence what elements of fear and hope exist in its nature, and they do not go very far, arise only in relation to objects that lie before it and within reach of those impulses. Whereas a man's range of vision embraces the whole of his life and extends far into the past and future. Following upon this, there is one respect in which brutes show real wisdom when compared to us. I mean their quiet, placid enjoyment of the present moment. The tranquility of mind which this seems to give them often puts us to shame, for the many times we allow our thoughts and our cares to make us restless and discontented. And in fact, those pleasures of hope and anticipation which I have been mentioning are not to be had for nothing. The delight which a man has in hoping for and looking forward to some special satisfaction is a part of the real pleasure attached to it, enjoyed in advance. This is afterwards deducted, for the more we look forward to anything, the less satisfaction we find in it when it comes. But the brute's enjoyment is not anticipated, and therefore suffers no deduction, so that the actual pleasure of the moment comes to it whole and unimpaired. In the same way, too, evil presses upon the brute only with its own intrinsic weight, whereas with us, the fear of it coming often makes its burden 10 times more grievous. It is just this characteristic way in which the brute gives itself up entirely to the present moment that contributes so much to the delight that we take in our domestic pets. They are the present moment personified, and in some respects they make us feel the value of every hour that is free from trouble and annoyance, which we, with our thoughts and preoccupations, mostly disregard. But man, that selfish and heartless creature, misuses this quality of the brute to be more content than we are with mere existence, and often works it to such an extent that he allows the brute absolutely nothing more than mere bare life. The bird which was made so that it might rove over half of the world he shuts up into the space of a cubic foot, there to die a slow death in longing and crying for freedom, for in a cage it does not sing for the pleasure of it. And when I see how man misuses the dog, his best friend, how he ties up this intelligent animal with a chain, I feel the deepest sympathy with the brute, and burning indignation against its master. We shall see later that by taking a very high standpoint, it is possible to justify the sufferings of mankind. But this justification cannot apply to animals, whose sufferings, while in a great measure brought about by men, are often considerable, even apart from their agency. And so we are forced to ask, why and for what purpose does all this torment and agony exist? There is nothing here to give the will pause. It is not free to deny itself, and so obtain redemption. There is only one consideration that may serve to explain the sufferings of animals. It is this, that the will to live, which underlies the whole world of phenomena, must, in their case, satisfy its cravings by feeding upon itself. This it does by forming a gradation of phenomena, every one of which exists at the expense of another, I have shown, however, that the capacity for suffering is less in animals than in man. Any further explanation that may be given of their fate will be in the nature of hypothesis, if not actually mythical in character, and I may leave the reader to speculate upon the matter for himself. Brahma is said to have produced the world by a kind of fall or mistake, and in order to atone for his folly he is bound to remain in it himself until he works out his redemption. As an account of the origin of things, that is admirable. According to the doctrines of Buddhism, the world came into being as the result of some inexplicable disturbance in the heavenly calm of nirvana, that blessed state obtained by expiation, which had endured for so long a time, the change taking place by a kind of fatality. This explanation must be understood as having at bottom some moral bearing, although it is illustrated by an exactly parallel theory in the domain of physical science, which places the origin of the sun in a primitive streak of mist, formed one knows not how. Subsequently, by a series of moral errors, the world became gradually worse and worse, true of the physical orders as well, until it assumed the dismal aspect it wears today. Excellent. The Greeks looked upon the world and the gods as the work of an inscrutable necessity, a passable explanation. We may be content with it until we can get a better. Again, Ormuzd and Ahriman are rival powers continually at war. That is not bad. But that a god like Jehovah should have created this world of misery and woe out of pure caprice, and because he enjoyed doing it, and should then have clapped his hands in praise of his own work and declared everything to be very good, that will not do at all. In its explanation of the origin of the world, Judaism is inferior to any other form of religious doctrine professed by a civilized nation, and it is quite in keeping with this that it is the only one which presents no trace whatever of any belief in the immortality of the soul. Even though Leibniz's contention that this is the best of all possible worlds were correct, that would not justify God in having created it, for he is the creator not of the world only, but of possibility itself, and therefore he ought to have so ordered possibility as that it would admit of something better. There are two things which make it impossible to believe that this world is the successful work of an all-wise, all-good, and at the same time, all-powerful being. Firstly, the misery which abounds in it everywhere, and secondly, the obvious imperfection of its highest product, man, who is a burlesque of what he should be. These things cannot be reconciled with any such belief. On the contrary, they are just the facts which support what I've been saying. They are our authority for viewing the world as the outcome of our own misdeeds, and therefore as something that had better not have been. Whilst, under the former hypothesis, they amount to a bitter accusation against the Creator and supply material for sarcasm, under the latter, they form an indictment against our own nature, our own will, and teach us a lesson of humility. They teach us to see that, like the children of a libertine, we come into the world with the burden of sin upon us, and that it is only through having continually to atone for this sin that our existence is so miserable, and that its end is death. There is nothing more certain than the general truth that it is the grievous sin of the world which has produced the grievous suffering of the world. I am not referring here to the physical connection between these two things lying in the realm of experience. My meaning is metaphysical. Accordingly, the sole thing that reconciles me to the Old Testament is the story of the fall. In my eyes, it is the only metaphysical truth in that book, even though it appears in the form of an allegory. There seems to me no better explanation of our existence than that it is the result of some false step, some sin of which we are paying the penalty. I cannot refrain from recommending the thoughtful reader a popular, but at the same time profound treatise on this subject by Claudius, which exhibits the essentially pessimistic spirit of Christianity. It is entitled, "Cursed is the ground for thy sake." Between the ethics of the Greeks and the ethics of the Hindus, there is a glaring contrast. In the one case, with the exception, it must be confessed, of Plato, the object of ethics is to enable a man to lead a happy life. In the other, It is to free and redeem him from life altogether, as is directly stated in the very first words of the Sankhya Karika. Allied with this is the contrast between the Greek and the Christian idea of death. It is strikingly presented in a visible form on a fine antique sarcophagus in the Gallery of Florence, which exhibits in relief the whole series of ceremonies attending a wedding in ancient times, from the formal offer to the evening when Hymen's torch lights the happy couple's home. Compare that with the Christian coffin, draped in mournful black and surmounted with a crucifix. How much significance there is in these two ways of finding comfort in death. They are opposed to each other, but each is right. The one points to the affirmation of the will to live, which remains sure of life for all time, however rapidly its forms may change. The other, in the symbol of suffering and death, points to the denial of the will to live, to redemption from this world, the domain of death and devil. And in the question between the affirmation and the denial of the will to live, Christianity is in the last resort right. The contrast which the New Testament presents when compared to the Old, according to the ecclesiastical view of the matter, is just that existing between my ethical system and the moral philosophy of Europe. The Old Testament represents man as under the dominion of law, in which, however, there is no redemption. The New Testament declares law to have failed, frees man from its dominion, and in its stead preaches the kingdom of grace, to be won by faith, love of neighbor, and entire sacrifice of self. This is the path of redemption from the evil of the world. The spirit of the New Testament is undoubtedly asceticism, however your Protestants and rationalists may twist it to suit their purpose. Asceticism is the denial of the will to live, and the transition from the Old Testament to the New, from the dominion of law to that of faith, from justification by works to redemption through the mediator, the domain of sin and death to eternal life in Christ, means, when taken in its real sense, the transition from the merely moral virtues to the denial of the will to live. My philosophy shows the metaphysical foundation of justice and the love of mankind, and points to the goal to which these virtues necessarily lead if they are practiced in perfection. At the same time, it is candid in confessing that a man must turn his back upon the world, and that the denial of the will to live is the way of redemption. It is therefore really at one with the spirit of the New Testament, whilst all other systems are couched in the spirit of the Old, that is to say, theoretically as well as practically, their result is Judaism, mere despotic theism. In this sense, then, my doctrine might be called the only true Christian philosophy, however paradoxical a statement this may seem to people who take superficial views, instead of penetrating to the heart of the matter. If you want a safe compass to guide you through life, and to banish all doubt as to the right way of looking at it, you cannot do better than accustom yourself to regard this world as a penitentiary, a sort of penal colony, or ergasterion, as the earliest philosopher called it. Amongst the Christian fathers, Origen, with praiseworthy courage, took this view, which is further justified by certain objective theories of life. I refer not to my own philosophy alone, but to the wisdom of all ages as expressed in Brahmanism and Buddhism, and in the sayings of Greek philosophers like Empedocles and Pythagoras,
I'm gonna go land on it,
as also by Cicero,
and you guys pick
in his
up one of
remark
the
that
other
the
ones
wise
when
men of old used to
it's
teach that we come into this world to pay the penalty of crime committed in another state of existence, a doctrine which formed part of the initiation into the mysteries. And Vanini, whom his contemporaries burned, finding that an easier task than to confute him, puts the same thing in a very forcible way.
I don't like that.
Man, he says,
I don't
is
like
so
that.
full of
That's
every
like...
kind of misery that were it not repugnant to the Christian religion, I should venture to affirm that if evil spirits exist at all, they have posed into human form and are now atoning for their crimes. And true Christianity, using the word in its right sense, also regards our existence as the consequence of sin and error. If you accustom yourself to this view of life, you will regulate your expectations accordingly, and cease to look upon all its disagreeable incidents, great and small, its sufferings, its worries, its misery, as anything unusual or irregular. Nay, you will find that everything is as it should be, in a world where each of us pays the penalty of existence in his own peculiar way. Amongst the evils of a penal colony is the society of those who form it. And if the reader is worthy of better company, he will need no words from me to remind him of what he has to put up with at present. If he has a soul above the common, or if he is a man of genius, he will occasionally feel like some noble prisoner of state, condemned to work in the galleys with common criminals.
Let's do the same thing that we just did.
He will follow his example,
I'll go get it, and you guys
try to isolate himself. In general, however, it should be said that this view of life will enable us to contemplate the so-called imperfections of the great majority of men, their moral and intellectual deficiencies, and the resulting base type of countenance, without any surprise, to say nothing of indignation. For we shall never cease to reflect where we are, and that the men about us are beings conceived and born in sin, and living to atone for it. That is what Christianity means in speaking of the sinful nature of man. Pardon's the word to all. Whatever folly men commit, be their shortcomings or their vices what they may, let us exercise forbearance, remembering that when these faults appear in others, it is our follies and vices that we behold. They are the shortcomings of humanity, to which we belong, whose faults, one and all, we share. Yes, even those very faults at which we now wax so indignant, merely because they have not yet appeared in ourselves.
What?
They are faults that do not lie on the surface, but they exist down there in the depths of our nature. And should anything call them forth, they will come and show themselves, just as we now see them in others. One man, it is true, may have faults that are absent in his fellow, and it is undeniable that the sum total of bad qualities is in some cases very large, for the difference of individuality between man and man passes all measure. In fact, the conviction that the world and man is something that had better not have been is of a kind to fill us with indulgence towards one another. Nay, from this point of view, we might well consider the proper form of address to be not Monsieur, Sir, Mein Herr, but my fellow sufferer, Soci Malorum, Compagnon de Misere. This may perhaps sound strange, but it is in keeping with facts. It puts others in a right light, and it reminds us of that which is after all the most necessary thing in life, the tolerance, patience, regard, and love of neighbor of which everyone stands in need, and which, therefore, every man owes to his fellow. This vanity finds expression in the whole way in which things exist, in the infinite nature of time and space, as opposed to the finite nature of the individual in both, in the ever-passing present moment as the only mode of actual existence, in the interdependence and relativity of all things, in continual becoming that of our being, in constant wishing and never being satisfied, in the long battle which forms the history of life, where every effort is checked by difficulties and stopped until they are overcome. Time is that in which all things pass away. It is merely the form under which the will to live, the thing in itself, and therefore imperishable, has revealed to it that its efforts are in vain. It is that agent by which, at every moment, all things in our hands become as nothing, and lose any real value they possess. That which has been exists no more. It exists as little as that which has never been. But of everything that exists you may say, in the next moment, that it has been. Hence, something of great importance now past is inferior to something of little importance now present, in that the latter is a reality, and related to the former as something to nothing. A man finds himself, to his great astonishment, suddenly existing after thousands and thousands of years of non-existence. He lives for a little while, and then, again, comes an equally long period when he must exist no more. The heart rebels against this, and feels that it cannot be true. The crudest intellect cannot speculate on such a subject without having a presentiment that time is something ideal in its nature. This ideality of time and space is the key to every true system of metaphysics, because it provides for quite another order of things that is to be met with in the domain of nature. This is why Kant is so great. Of every event in our life, we can say only for one moment that it is, forever after that it was. Every evening we are poorer by a day. It might perhaps make us mad to see how rapidly our short span of time ebbs away, if it were not that, in the furthest depths of our being, we are secretly conscious of our share in the inexhaustible spring of eternity, so that we might always hope to find life in it again. Consideration of the kind touched on above might indeed lead us to embrace the belief that the greatest wisdom is to make the enjoyment of the present the supreme object of life, because that is the only reality, all else being merely the play of thought.
I know.
On the other hand, such a course might just as well be called the greatest folly, for that which in the next moment exists no more and vanishes utterly, like a dream, can never be worth a serious effort.
Sure.
The whole foundation on which our existence rests is the present, the ever-fleeting present. It lies, then, in the very nature of our existence to take the form of constant motion, and to offer no possibility of our ever attaining the rest for which we are always striving. We are like a man running downhill who cannot keep on his legs unless he runs on, and will inevitably fall if he stops. Or again, like a pole balanced on the tip of one's fingers, or a planet which would fall into its sun the moment it ceased to hurry forward on its way. Unrest is the mark of existence. In a world where all is unstable, and naught can endure, but is swept onward at once in the hurrying whirlpool of change, where a man, if he is to keep erect at all, must always be advancing and moving like an acrobat on a rope. In such a world, happiness is inconceivable. How can it dwell where, as Plato says, continual becoming and never being is the sole form of existence? In the first place, a man never is happy, but spends his whole life in striving after something which he thinks will make him so.
The helicopter here.
He seldom attains his goal, and when he does, it is only to be disappointed. He is mostly shipwrecked in the end, and comes into harbor with masts and rigging gone. And then, it is all one whether he has been happy or miserable, for his life was never anything more than a present moment always vanishing, and now it is over. At the same time, it is a wonderful thing that, in the world of human beings as in that of animals in general, this manifold restless motion is produced and kept up by the agency of two simple impulses, hunger and the sexual instinct, aided a little, perhaps, by the influence of boredom, but by nothing else, and that, in the theater of life, these suffice to form the primum mobile of how complicated a machinery, setting in motion, how strange and varied a scene.
I got a mine on either side.
On looking a little closer, we find that inorganic matter presents a constant conflict between chemical forces, which eventually works dissolution. And on the other hand, that organic life is impossible without constant change of matter. It cannot exist if it does not receive perpetual help from without.
Guys have any rockets?
This is the realm of finality, and its opposite would be an infinite existence, exposed to no attack from without and needing nothing to support it. The realm of eternal peace, some timeless, changeless state, one and undiversified, the negative knowledge of which forms the dominant note of the Platonic philosophy. It is to some such state as this that the denial of the will to live opens up the way. The scenes of our life are like pictures done in rough mosaic. Looked at close, they produce no effect. There is nothing beautiful to be found in them, unless you stand some distance off. So, to gain anything we have longed for is only to discover how vain and empty it is. And even though we are always living in expectation of better things, at the same time we often repent and long to have the past back again. We look upon the present as something to be put up with while it lasts, and serving only as the way towards our goal. Hence, most people, if they glance back when they come to the end of life, will find that all along they have been living ad interim. They will be surprised to find that the very thing they disregarded and let slip by unenjoyed was just the life in the expectation of which they passed all their time.
Yeah.
Of how many a man may it
Over
not be
this
said
hill.
that hope made a fool of him until he danced into the arms of death? Then again, how insatiable a creature is man! Every satisfaction he attains lays the seeds of some new desire, so that there is no end to the wishes of each individual will. And why is this?
Building, it is right in the middle.
The real reason is simply that, taken in itself, will is the lord of all worlds. Everything belongs to it, and therefore
Is this where we're hiding
no
out?
one single thing can ever give it satisfaction, but only the whole,
Better.
which is endless. For all that, it must rouse our sympathy to think how very little the will, this lord of the world, really gets when it takes the form of an individual. Usually only just enough to keep the body together. This is why man is so very miserable. Life presents itself chiefly as a task. The task, I mean, of subsisting at all. Gagner sa vie. If this is accomplished, life is a burden, and then there comes the second task of doing something with that which has been won, of warding off boredom, which, like a bird of prey, hovers over us, ready to fall whenever it sees a life secure from need. The first task is to win something, the second, to banish the feeling that it has been won. Otherwise, it is a burden. Human life must be some kind of mistake. The truth of this will be sufficiently obvious if we only remember that man is a compound of needs and necessities hard to satisfy, and that even when they are satisfied, all he obtains is a state of painlessness, where nothing remains to him but abandonment to boredom.
Yep.
This is direct proof that existence has no real value in itself. For what is boredom but the feeling of the emptiness of life? If life, the craving for which is the very essence of our being, were possessed of any positive intrinsic value, there would be no such thing as boredom at all. Mere existence would satisfy us in itself,
Dude.
and we should want for nothing.
Oh, you
But
went out of
as
the
it is,
building.
we take no
Yeah,
delight
I
in
wanted to go
existence
see
except when
something,
we
I
are
fucked
struggling
up.
for something. And then, distance and difficulties to be overcome make our goal look as though it would satisfy us. An illusion which vanishes when we reach it, or else when we are occupied with some purely intellectual interest, when in reality, we have stepped forth from life to look upon it from the outside,
How do you get a sniper?
much after the manner of spectators at a play.
Whoa.
And even sensual pleasure itself means nothing but a struggle and aspiration, ceasing the moment its aim is attained. Whenever we are not occupied in one of these ways, but cast upon existence itself, its vain and worthless nature is brought home to us, and this is what we mean by boredom. The hankering after what is strange and uncommon, an innate and ineradicable tendency of human nature, shows how glad we are at any interruption of that natural course of affairs which is so very tedious. That this most perfect manifestation of the will to live, the human organism, with the cunning and complex working of its machinery, must fall to dust and yield up itself and all its strivings to
By
extinction.
the
This is the naive way in which nature, who is always so true and sincere in what she says, proclaims the whole struggle of this will as, in its very essence, barren and unprofitable. Were it of any value in itself, anything unconditioned and absolute, it could not thus end in mere nothing. If we turn from contemplating the world as a whole, and in particular the generations of men as they live their little hour of mock existence, and then are swept away in rapid succession, if we turn from this, and look at life in its small details, as presented, say, in a comedy, how ridiculous it all seems. It is like a drop of water seen through a microscope, a single drop, teeming with infusoria, or a speck of cheese full of mites invisible to the naked eye.
I think they're gonna come.
How we laugh as they bustle about so eagerly and struggle with one another in so tiny a space.
Run around.
And whether here, or in the little span of human life, this terrible activity produces a comic effect. It is only in the microscope that our life looks so big. It is an indivisible point, drawn out and magnified by the powerful lenses of time and space. End chapter 2. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
I don't understand.
Studies in Pessimism
He
by
ran
Arthur
over the
Schopenhauer.
Claymore, and I
Chapter
shot
3.
him.
On Suicide. As far as I know, none but the
Honestly, I don't
votaries
get
of
it.
monotheistic,
I don't get
that is to say, Jewish religions, look upon suicide as a crime.
That doesn't make any
This
sense.
is all the more
that you can
striking,
just run over things
inasmuch
with
as neither in
swords.
the Old nor in the New Testament is there to be found any prohibition or positive disapproval of it,
He's in this center to the right.
so that religious
You got
teachers
him.
are forced to base their
buddy.
condemnation of suicide on philosophical grounds of their own invention. These are so very bad that writers of
Stop
this
my
kind
dick, you
endeavor to
fucking
make up
pussy.
for the weakness of their arguments by the strong terms in which they express their abhorrence of the practice. In other words, they declaim against it.
Hit me with that.
They tell us that suicide is the greatest piece of
Yes,
cowardice,
sir.
that only a madman could be guilty of it, and other
That's
insipidities
what I
of the
like.
same kind.
Oh fuck, man, this.
Or else they make the nonsensical remark that suicide is wrong,
Let's fucking go.
when it is quite obvious that there is nothing in the world to which every man has a more unassailable
I'm
title
taking a
than
look
to his own
around.
life and person. Suicide, as I've said, is actually accounted a crime, and a crime which, especially under the vulgar bigotry that prevails in England, is followed by an ignominious burial and the seizure of the man's property. And for that reason, in a case of suicide, the jury almost always brings in a verdict of insanity.
I want my gun
Now,
back.
let the reader's own moral feelings decide as to whether or not suicide is a criminal act.
Yeah, but
Think of the impression that would be made upon you by the news that someone you know had committed the crime, say, of murder or theft, or been guilty of some act of cruelty or deception. And compare it with your feelings when you hear that he has met a voluntary
where the fuck is
death.
my gun? Did they take
While
my
in the
gun?
one case a lively sense of indignation and extreme resentment will be
I
aroused,
didn't take your gun.
and you will call loudly for punishment or revenge. In the other,
Oh, he's fucking
you will be moved to
crazy.
grief and sympathy,
Fucking-
and mingled with
Yeah,
your
I think he
thoughts will
took
be
my gun.
admiration for his courage, rather
Yes,
than the
Alex.
moral
Oh my
disapproval
God.
which follows upon a wicked
Oh,
action.
nice.
I don't know, Alex.
Ammo in it.
Who has not had
Do you
acquaintances,
have a growl? Is that your
friends,
gun?
relations, who of their
I've
own
heard
will have left
No,
this
they
world?
definitely took my growl.
I have the gun.
And are these to be thought of with horror as criminals?
I don't know where you're going.
Most emphatically,
I think
no.
he took my gun.
I am rather of opinion that the clergy should be challenged to explain
Oh, I
what
don't
right
know.
they have to go into the pulpit, or take up their pens and stamp as a crime an action which many men, whom we hold in affection
It
and
doesn't
honor,
matter.
have committed,
No, I
and to
popped
refuse an honorable
Oh,
burial
yeah, I
to
had
those
one.
who relinquish this
There's that
world
growl, but
voluntarily.
It's good.
They have no biblical authority to boast of as justifying their condemnation of
taking the
suicide.
fire
assault rifle.
Nay, not even any philosophical arguments that will hold water. And it must be understood that it is arguments we want, and that we will not be put off with mere phrases or words of abuse. If the criminal law forbids suicide,
Alright, so let me
that is
think.
not an argument valid in the church, and besides, the prohibition is ridiculous. For what penalty can frighten a man who is not afraid of death itself? If the law punishes people for trying to commit suicide, it is punishing the want of skill that makes the attempt a failure. The ancients, moreover, were very far from regarding the matter in that light. Pliny says, "Life is not so
yeah,
desirable a
that's it.
thing as to be protracted at any cost.
Whoever
you are, you are sure to die, even though your life has been full of abomination and crime.
That's so
The
basic.
chief of all remedies
Fuck
for a
yeah,
troubled
dude.
mind is the feeling that among the blessings which nature gives to man, there is none greater than an opportune death. And the best of it is that everyone can avail himself of it." And elsewhere, the same writer declares, "Not even to God are all things possible, for he could not compass his own death if he willed to die." And yet, in all the miseries of our earthly life, this is the best of his gifts to man.
To watch people jumping
Nay,
down, or we're gonna have to watch
in Massilia and on the island of Seos,
No.
the man who could give valid reasons for relinquishing his
Yeah,
life
there's a
was
mine
handed
right
the cup of
here.
hemlock by the magistrate,
Yeah, there's one on that door and one on
and that
door.
too, in public.
It's watching the
And in
windows.
ancient times, how many heroes and wise men died a voluntary death?
With the deployable cover.
Aristotle, it is
Okay.
true,
I'm on this
declared suicide to be an offense against the state, although not against the person. But in Stobaeus' exposition of the peripatetic philosophy there is the following remark: "The good man should flee life when his misfortunes become too great. The bad man, also, when he is too prosperous. And similarly, so he will marry and beget children, and take part in the affairs of the state, and generally practice virtue and continue to live.
Got arranged for me now.
And then, again, if need be, and at any time necessity compels him, he will depart to his place of refuge in the tomb." And we find that the Stoics actually praised suicide as a noble and heroic action, as hundreds of passages show.
Top of the hill.
Above all, in the works of Seneca, who expresses the strongest approval of it.
Pretty much, and then,
As is well known, the Hindus look upon suicide as a religious act, especially when it takes the form of self-immolation by widows, but also
Yes,
when it
sir.
consists in casting oneself under the wheels of the chariot of the god at Juggernaut, or being eaten by crocodiles in the Ganges, or being drowned in the holy tanks in the temples, and so on. The same thing occurs on the stage, that mirror of life. For example, in L'Orphelin de la Chine, a celebrated Chinese play, almost all the noble characters end by suicide, without the slightest hint anywhere, or any impression being produced on the spectator, that they are committing a crime. And in our own theatre is much the same. Palmyra, for instance, in Mahomet, or Mortimer, in Maria Stuart. Othello, Countess
Someone knows I'm
Terzky.
here now.
Is Hamlet's monologue the meditation of a criminal?
Confirmed.
He merely declares that if we had any certainty of being annihilated by it, death would be infinitely preferable to the world as it is. But there lies the rub. The reasons advanced against suicide by the clergy of monotheistic, that is to say, Jewish religions, and by those philosophers who adapt themselves thereto, are weak sophisms which can easily be refuted. The most thoroughgoing refutation of them is given by Hume in his essay on suicide. This did not appear until after his death, when it was immediately suppressed, owing to the scandalous bigotry and outrageous ecclesiastical tyranny that prevailed in England. And hence, only a very few copies of it were sold under cover of secrecy and at a high price. This and another treatise by that great man have come to us from Basel, and we may be thankful for the reprint. It is a great disgrace to the English nation that a purely philosophical treatise, which, proceeding from one of the first thinkers and writers in England, aimed at refuting the current arguments against suicide by the light of cold reason, should be forced to sneak about in that country,
This is
as though it were some
unbelievable.
rascally production, until at last it found refuge on the
that we lost
continent.
because of this, because of the rocks.
At the same time, it shows what a good
Unbelievable.
conscience the Church has in such matters. In my chief work, I have explained the only valid reason
Oh
existing
my
against
God.
suicide on the score of morality. It is this:
Oh my
that
god.
suicide thwarts the attainment
God.
of the highest
I'm
moral
so
aim by the
angry.
fact that, for a real release from this world of misery,
Okay.
it substitutes one that is merely apparent. But from a mistake to a crime is a far cry, and it is as a crime that the clergy of Christendom wish us to regard suicide. Translator's note. Schopenhauer refers to Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung, Volume 1, Section 69, where the reader may find the same
Alrighty,
argument stated
boys.
at somewhat greater
Let's
length.
fucking go.
According to
Alright, I'm gonna
Schopenhauer,
go,
moral
I'm gonna
freedom,
go to
the highest
fucking,
ethical aim,
port with whoever wants
is to be
come.
obtained only by a denial of the
If
will
we're
to
gonna do
live.
2 and 2 today.
Far from being a denial, suicide is an
Yeah, so
emphatic
so-
assertion of this
Alright,
will.
so you go for the heli,
For
I'll go for the
It is in
recon,
fleeing from the
okay?
pleasures, not the sufferings of life, that this denial consists. When a man destroys his existence as an individual, he is not by any means destroying his will to live. On the contrary, he would like to live if he could do so with satisfaction to
Who the
himself,
fuck is trying to
if he
shoot
could
me?
assert his will against the power of circumstance.
Yo, you guys
But circumstance is too strong for him.
Get Jeff to call in to
And
Tequila Bookworm
footnote.
and see if they'll give you online ordering for free.
The inmost kernel of Christianity is the truth that suffering,
Yeah,
the
'cause
cross,
they have
is the real
mention,
end
like,
and
'cause
object of
They
life.
can tie it onto the website.
Hence,
You can get
Christianity
orders,
condemns
just come into the
suicide as
fucking
thwarting
point
this
and
end,
Yeah,
whilst
but
in the ancient
it's
world,
like, I
taking
know
a
how
lower
your
point of
API
view,
works.
held
The
it in
problem
approval,
is the fact that
nay,
we just have
in honor.
like at any given point 150
But if that is to be
products,
accounted
right?
a valid reason
Like,
against
'cause I know how to
suicide,
touch beach.
Yeah.
it involves the recognition of asceticism.
Because
Yeah, that's
to say,
fucking
it is valid only from a much higher
right?
ethical standpoint than has ever been adopted by moral philosophers in Europe.
The menu, so you can
If we abandon that high standpoint, there is no tenable reason left, on the score of morality, for
Yeah.
condemning
Yeah.
suicide.
the way that,
The extraordinary energy and zeal with which the clergy of monotheistic religions attack suicide is not supported either by any passages in the Bible or by any considerations of weight, so that it looks as though they must have some secret reason for their contention. May it not be this, that the voluntary surrender of life is a bad compliment for him who said that all things were very good?
Like it's like it's like
If
the
this is
cheapest
so,
that I could find
it
was
offers another
$1,000
instance
for
of the
pretty much
crass
what we would need
optimism
to do,
of these
but still, it's
religions,
like, the problem is
denouncing
like,
suicide to
oh, no,
escape
it's good,
being
but the
denounced
amount of
by it.
back-end fucking work that needs to happen.
It will generally be found that as soon as the terrors of life reach the point at which they outweigh the terrors of death,
I'm stuck.
a man will put an end to his life. But the terrors of death offer considerable resistance.
George, should I, do you want me to grab
They stand
you
like
for
a
the
sentinel
recon
at the
here?
gate leading out of this world.
Yeah.
Perhaps there is no man alive who would not have already put an end to his
Than I
life,
thought I
if
would.
this end had been of a purely negative character,
No, I'll
sudden
run.
stoppage
You
of
guys go. You
existence.
guys go. I'll come over to you guys.
There is something positive about it,
Yeah.
It is the destruction of the body. And a man shrinks from that because his body is the manifestation of the
Yep.
will to live.
Heard.
But
I
what
see you,
about
buddy.
D? Like,
However,
are you
Yes,
guys
sir.
focused
The
on,
struggle
like,
with that
having,
sentinel
like,
is, as a
specific
rule, not
itemized,
so
like,
hard as it may
inventory
seem from a long way
breakdowns?
off,
Well, the thing is,
mainly in
most of the-
consequence of the
most
antagonism
most of
between
the-
the
most
ills of
stuff
the
that
body
we
and
get,
the
we only
ills of
get
the mind.
24. The big problem
If we are
is
in a
it's
great
like,
bodily
for example, what
pain,
happened today is
or the pain
we
lasts a long time,
sell
become
out of
indifferent to
something
other
in
troubles.
store faster than
All we think
you
about
can
is
update
to
it
get well.
because of the fact that only one person is working.
In the
and
same
one
way,
person
great
needs
mental
also
suffering
update the
makes us
website, and also
insensible
one
to
person
bodily
needs to
pain.
monitor the
We
delivery,
despise it.
right?
Nay,
So it's like
if
you
it
get
should
an hour and
outweigh
a
the
half of
other,
being
it
crushed,
distracts
you
our
go through
thoughts,
that case really quickly.
and
you
we
know
welcome
what I mean?
it as a pause in mental suffering.
Like it's like
It is this feeling that makes suicide easy, for the bodily pain that accompanies it loses all significance in the eyes of one who is tortured by an excess of mental
while
suffering.
doing about $1,000 in sales.
This is
during-
especially evident in the case of those who are driven to suicide by some
But
purely
anyways.
morbid and exaggerated ill humor.
No, that's a fucking nightmare, and it's funny.
No
because
special
I keep
effort to
getting
overcome
these
their feelings is
businesses coming in
necessary,
in California that
nor
have,
do
like,
such people
huge
require to be
wine
worked
clubs,
up
like,
in
have
order to take the
curbside
step.
pickup. They got
But as soon as the keeper,
650
into whose charge they are
orders all
given,
at once,
leaves
pretty
them
much
for a
in the span
couple of minutes,
15 minutes that come through
they
their
quickly bring
channel
their life to an
because
end.
they're like a brewing company. And they're like,
When,
we don't- there's
in some
nothing
dreadful
out
and
here for
ghastly
us unless
dream,
build it our
we
own,
reach
or,
the
like,
moment
even
of greatest
just get a
horror.
CRM system
It
that
awakes
has,
us,
like,
thereby
where
banishing
you
all
can
the
do
hideous shapes that were
multiple
born of the
buildings.
night.
That's like the biggest need. Like,
And life
I
is
could,
a
like,
dream.
bill, like 50 people at once.
When the moment of greatest horror compels us to break it off, the same thing
You
happens.
guys should do like the beer club, wine club shit.
Suicide may
People
also
crush
be
that in the
regarded
States.
as an experiment, a question which man puts to nature, trying to force her to an answer. The question is this: what change will death produce in a man's
just gonna
existence, and in his insight
Gee, I think your mic
into the
is
nature of
fucked,
things?
What's it sound like?
It is a clumsy experiment to make,
You're just like cutting
for it
it
involves
out.
the destruction of the very consciousness which puts the question and awaits the answer. End Chapter 3. This recording is in the public domain.
Anyone got extra armor, or is that like...
Nope.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer,
This blue gun is
please
such a
visit
pile of
LibriVox.org.
Whatever the fuck this thing is. You know that one?
Studies
that
in
you pick up,
Pessimism
like,
by Arthur
I think it's
Schopenhauer.
a
Chapter 4.
SMG
semi-automatic.
or
SM,
Immortality,
it's an SMG, yeah,
a dialogue.
The blue one that and it has the double sight.
Translator's note. The word immortality
Unsterblichkeit, does not occur in the original, nor would it, in its usual application, find a place in Schopenhauer's vocabulary.
In this fucking...
The word he uses is Unzerstörbarkeit, indestructibility. But I have preferred immortality, because that word is commonly associated with the subject touched upon in this little debate.
Not getting shot at.
If any critic doubts the wisdom of this preference, let me ask him to try his hand at a short, concise, and at the same time, popularly intelligible rendering of the German original, which runs thus. Zur Lehre von der Unzerstörbarkeit unseres wahren Wesens durch den Tod. Meine dialogische Schlussbelustigung.
How is there
And
no
footnote.
fucking armor in this fucking bitch?
Dramatis Personae, Thrasymachus, and Philolethes. Thrasymachus. Tell me now, in one word, what shall I be after my
I was
death?
trying to take the gas.
And mind you,
Yeah.
clear and precise. Philolethes. All and nothing,
You can always buy one.
Thrasymachus. I thought
What
so.
about UAV?
I gave you a problem and you solve it by a contradiction. That's a very stale trick. Philolethes. Yes,
You don't look
but you
bad.
raise transcendental questions,
Man.
and you expect me to answer them in language that is only made for imminent knowledge.
Man's down there.
It's no wonder that a contradiction ensues.
Jump in and let's get out of
Thrasymachus.
here.
What do you mean by transcendental questions and imminent
I
knowledge?
down both of them. I down
I've heard
both
these
of them.
expressions before, of course. They're not new to me. The professor was fond of using them, but only as predicates of the deity, and he never talked of anything else, which was all quite right and proper. He argued thus. If the deity was in the world itself, he was immanent. If he was somewhere outside it, he was transcendent. Nothing could be clearer and more obvious. You knew where you were. But this Kantian rigmarole won't do anymore. It's antiquated and no longer applicable to modern ideas.
Oh,
You got it
no.
right there.
Why, we've had a whole row of eminent men in the metropolis of German learning. Philolethes. German humbug, he means.
Oh, and I'm
Thrasymachus. The mighty Schleiermacher, for instance,
Stupid.
and that gigantic intellect Hegel. And at this time of day, we've abandoned that nonsense. I should rather say, we're so far beyond it that we can't put up with it anymore. What's the use of it then? What does it all mean? Philolethes. Transcendental knowledge is knowledge which passes beyond the bounds of possible experience. It strives to determine the nature of things as they are in themselves. Immanent knowledge, on the other hand, is knowledge which confines itself entirely
Oh,
with
yeah,
those
bad
bounds,
boys.
so that it cannot apply to anything but actual phenomena. As far as you are an individual, death will be the end of you. But your individuality is not your true and inmost being. It is only the outward manifestation of it. It is not the thing in itself,
Where should I
but
drop
only
on
the
you
phenomenon presented in the form of time, and therefore with a beginning and an end. But your real being knows neither time nor beginning nor end, nor yet the limits of any given individual.
my God.
It is everywhere present, in every individual, and no individual can exist apart from it. So when death comes, on the one hand, you are annihilated as an individual.
Right?
On the other,
Right, come
you
get your
are
stuff and get some-
and remain everything. That is what I meant when I said that after your death, you would be all and nothing.
That's fair. That's unfair.
It is difficult to find a more precise answer to your question, and at the same time be brief.
Too.
The answer is contradictory, I admit, but it is so simply because your life is in time, and the immortal
there we
part of
go.
you in eternity.
You want to land here, Scott? You want to come here?
You may put the matter thus.
No one around.
Your immortal part is something that does not last in time and yet is indestructible.
Yeah, I wish
But there
it was
you have
that
another
easy.
contradiction.
You want to go loot where you died? Oh,
You see what happens by trying to bring the transcendental within the limits of immanent
Getting
knowledge?
shot at?
yeah.
It is in some sort doing violence to the latter by misusing it for ends it was never meant to serve.
Alright,
The chopper's
Let's go.
almost done.
Look
let's
here,
go.
I shan't give 2 pence for your immortality unless I'm to remain an individual. Philolethes.
Just flying
Well,
to this chopper.
Perhaps I may be able to satisfy you on this point. Suppose I guarantee that after death
know,
you shall
take a look
remain
at
an
this.
individual, but only
Dear
on
you, dear
condition
black man.
that you first
Yes,
spend
sir.
3 months
Yes,
of
sir.
complete unconsciousness.
And that's still the funniest thing.
Thrasymachus.
One of the
I shall have no
funniest,
objection
funny
to that.
things for me, that politician with his gay
Philolethes.
black man burner account.
But remember,
If people are completely unconscious, they take no account of time. So when you are dead, it's all the same to you whether 3 months pass in the world of consciousness, or 10,000 years.
Happens to me all the time.
In the one case as in the other, it is simply a matter of believing what is told you when you awake.
You guys
So
go
far then,
Ghost?
you can
Yeah,
afford to be
always.
indifferent, whether it is 3 months or 10,000 years that pass
Ghost.
before you recover your individuality.
Yeah, I'm in this chopper, but it's like...
Thrasymachus. Yes, if it comes to that, I suppose you're right,
Crashed at the slightest hint of-
Philolethes. And
Another
if,
chopper
by
we can fly
chance,
to?
after those 10,000 years have
Lower,
gone
lower,
by,
lower.
I'm coming.
no one
I'm
ever
coming. I'm
thinks
sorry, I
of
got stuck in this fucking
awakening
building.
you, I fancy it would be no great misfortune. You would have become
Oh.
quite accustomed to non-existence
We'll be
after
fine.
so
We'll
long
be
a
fine.
spell of it, following upon such a very few years of life. At any rate,
Okay, we gotta
you may
jump.
be sure you would be
Damage.
perfectly ignorant of the whole
Get
thing.
out.
Further, if you knew that the mysterious power which keeps you in your present state of life had
Tried
never
to jump
once
out and I kept
ceased
jumping back in.
in those
I did too
10,000
just
years to
now.
bring forth other phenomena
Where are
like
you,
yourself,
Scott?
and to endow them with life,
Outside this door here.
it would fully console you,
Whoa,
She's like
where?
27.
Thrasymachus. Indeed. So you think
Can I
you're
come in?
quietly going to do me out of my individuality with all of this fine talk,
Are you gonna get Scott?
Yeah, I got
but
him.
I'm up to your
Please,
tricks.
God.
I tell you, I won't exist
a lot
unless
of
I can
shit in
have
this
my
building.
individuality. I'm not going to be put off with mysterious powers
No
and
worries,
what you
buddy.
call
Do you
phenomena.
need where
I
are you,
can't
Scott?
do without my individuality,
Here,
and I
take some
won't
of
give
this
it
quick.
up. Philolethes.
Trophy here, I got
You
armor
mean,
crate,
I
can
suppose,
drop
that
it.
your individuality
I
is such a
also have an
delightful
armor
thing,
crate too. I didn't
so
realize.
splendid, so
I'm
perfect,
gonna
and
drop it
beyond
then, 'cause
compare,
I need-
that you can't imagine anything better?
Yeah.
Oh, it's fucking...
Aren't you ready to exchange your present
good.
state
It
for
doesn't
one which, if we can judge by what is told us, may possibly be superior and more endurable?
She must have.
Thrasymachus. Don't you see that my individuality, be it what it may, is my very self? To me it is the most
How are
important
your
thing in the world.
animals- How are your animals?
For God is
seeing?
God, and I am
Animals
I. I want to exist. I. That's the main thing. I don't care about an existence
Is
which
it
has
good?
to be proved to be
Everybody's
mine
good.
before I can believe it.
All
How's
right.
the little kitty? She
Philolethes.
doesn't get the
is-
same coverage she used to, you know?
Think what you're doing.
Everybody's.
When you
got a
say,
good life, man.
I
Matt's
want to
happy,
exist.
Alex is
We-
happy.
It is not you alone that says
I'm
this.
flying, I'm parachuting.
Everything
off the ceiling
says
to
it.
that, so-
Absolutely
Yeah.
everything
Green
that
is
has the
happy.
faintest trace of consciousness.
Third
It
interrupt.
follows, then, that this desire of yours is just the part of you that
When are we
is
all gonna go
not
to Greece?
individual, the part that is common to all things without distinction,
Care about the
It is the
Rona over
crime.
there.
not of the individual, but of existence itself. It is the intrinsic element in everything that exists. Nay, it is the cause of anything existing at all. This desire craves for, and so is satisfied with, nothing less than existence in general. Not any definite individual existence. No, that is not its aim. It seems to be so only because this desire, this will, attains consciousness only in the individual, and therefore
You guys wanna
looks
try
as
and go
though
this
it were
one, or
concerned with
do
nothing
you
but
guys
the
go
individual.
that direction?
there lies the illusion. An illusion, it is true, in which the individual is held fast, but if he reflects,
Okay, I'm going up
he
to
can break
roof
the
and
fetters
parachute off.
and set himself free. It is only indirectly, I say, that the individual has this violent craving for existence. It is the will to live, which is the real and direct aspirant, alike and identical in all things.
My last UAV got stolen.
Since then, existence
Another one.
is the free work, nay, the mere reflection of the will. Where existence is, there too must be will. And for the moment,
There's that dude on
the will
our
finds
right.
its satisfaction in
by
existence
the
itself.
car.
So far, I mean, as that which never rests but presses forward eternally can never find any satisfaction at all.
Hearing a lot of
The will
gunfire,
is
but I
careless
don't
of the
see
individual.
anything even
The
popping
individual
up
is
on the
not
main
its
map.
business. Although, as I've said, this seems to be the case because the individual has no direct consciousness
Yo,
of will
it's
except
Cold
in
War.
himself.
That building?
The effect of this
It was Cold War.
is
gonna
to make
have
the
a
individual
similar
careful
thing,
to maintain
like
his
an
own
online like
existence.
this.
And if this were not so, there would be no surety for the preservation of the species.
You either-
So
From
you
all
can
this,
use your, like,
It is clear
can
that
use your Cold War
individuality
guns or
is
your
not a
Modern War
form
guns.
of perfection,
That's
but
what
rather
we
of
do,
limitation.
yeah, supposedly.
And so to
So
be
the whole-
freed from it is not
the whole
loss
system's
but
different
gain.
between both the games.
Trouble yourself no more about the matter.
yeah, right?
Once, thoroughly
It would be
recognize
sick
what you
if
are,
could have
what your existence
cross-platform
really is, namely,
guns.
the universal
That would be
will to
Supposedly
live.
that's what they're doing. Supposedly they've
And
got
the
a
whole
plan, it's
question
all
will
gonna
seem
come
to you
together,
childish and most ridiculous.
That's actually so
Thrasymachus.
sick. Oh, there's a guy.
There's
You're
a dude
childish
that
yourself
deflated
and
right
most
there, yeah.
ridiculous, like all philosophers.
Yeah.
And if a man of my age lets himself in for a quarter of an hour's talk with such fools, it is only because it amuses me and passes the time. I've more important business to attend to, so goodbye.
Guy that just landed here.
There is an unconscious propriety in the way in which, in all European languages,
He may have
the
gone the
word
other way,
person
but-
is commonly used to denote a human being. The real meaning of persona
Do I have to hit
is
the
a
UAV?
mask, such as actors were
There's a
accustomed
dude
to wear
right
on the
beside me
ancient
that just killed
stage.
me for no reason.
And
God
it is
damn
quite true that no one shows himself as he
Oh.
is, but wears his mask and plays his part. Indeed, the whole of our social arrangements may be likened to a perpetual comedy,
Oh, they're buying back.
and this is why a
guys
man
here.
who is worth anything finds society so insipid, while a blockhead is quite at home in it.
I'm on the recon by myself.
Reason deserves to be called a prophet, for in showing us the consequence and effect of our actions in the present, does it not tell us what the future will be? This is precisely why reason is such an excellent power of restraint in moments when we are possessed by some base passion, some fit of anger, some covetous desire, that will lead us to do things whereof we must presently repent.
Yo, I'm getting pinned down here.
Hatred
Yeah,
comes
where
from
are
the
you,
heart,
I got
contempt
guys on both sides.
from the
Over
head.
Here.
George? Come to the roof.
and neither feeling is quite within our control.
On the roof.
For we cannot alter our heart. Its basis is determined by motives, and our head deals with objective facts and applies to the
I think I got it
rules
pretty
which
high.
are
Okay, I'm coming
immutable.
up.
Jump
Any
over
given
there.
individual
You can give me your
is the
money.
union
Oh,
of
I'm
a
gonna go
particular
get you
heart
right now.
with a particular head.
There's a guy in this building.
Hatred and contempt are diametrically opposed and mutually exclusive. There are even not a few cases where hatred of a person is rooted in nothing but
Yes,
forced
sir.
esteem for his
That's what I'm
qualities.
talking about.
Shit.
And besides, if a man sets out to hate all the miserable creatures he meets, he will not have much energy left for anything else,
Oh, he just clutched a strike.
whereas he can
Flat me.
despise
Okay,
them,
I
one
mean,
and all,
it-
with the greatest
It ran away
ease.
from the buy station.
True, genuine contempt is just the reverse of true, genuine pride. It keeps quiet and gives no sign of its existence. For if a man shows that he despises
Fuck, I
you,
didn't know that.
Yeah.
he signifies at least this much regard for you, that he wants to let you know how little he appreciates you, and his wish is dictated by hatred, which cannot exist with real contempt.
Sorry,
On the
I just
contrary,
ran into a
if
guy
it
there.
is
Was someone
genuine,
at the buy
it
station?
is simply the conviction
Yeah,
that the
don't go to
object
buy.
of it is a man of
killed
no
one and
value at
then,
all.
Want to click on a buy station?
Contempt
you
is
think?
not incompatible with indulgent and kindly
We gotta move
treatment,
soon too, eh?
and for the sake of one's own peace and safety,
I can't ping
I
that
killed
should
a
not
guy
be
across
admitted.
there.
it will prevent
Killed a
irritation.
guy over there.
And there is no one who cannot do harm if he is roused to it.
Can't you ping when you're
But if
in the
this
gulag?
pure, cold,
Oh, fuck.
sincere contempt ever shows itself,
One's covered.
Yo,
it will be
yo,
met
yo,
with the
Keller.
most truculent hatred,
This guy's over there.
where the
sniping me.
despised person is not in a position
Fuck.
to fight
Yeah, we gotta-
contempt with its
Yeah,
own
we gotta go.
weapons.
The gas is coming too. Going down the
Yeah.
back.
I'm gonna go for that buy station.
Melancholy
Gas
is a very different thing from bad humor,
You got him.
and of the two,
Yeah, buddy.
it is not nearly so far removed from a gay and happy temperament. Melancholy attracts,
Gorgeous.
while bad humor repels.
Dude, lethal kills.
Hypochondria
Oh,
is a species of torment which
fuck,
not
I
only
got
makes us
killed.
unreasonably cross with the things of the present,
How I got
not only fills us with
Wow,
groundless
this guy-
anxiety on the
great
score
name.
of
That was fun.
future misfortunes entirely of our own manufacture, but also leads to unmerited self-reproach for what we have done in the past.
Fuck, I can't ping that most one.
Hypochondria shows itself in a perpetual hunting after things that vex and annoy, and then brooding over them. The cause of it is an inward, morbid discontent, often coexisting with a naturally restless temperament.
This is a spicy way. This is
In
a
their
spicy
extreme
place
form,
to end the map.
This
Jeez.
discontent and this unrest
Like in the
lead
middle
to
of all the
suicide.
high rises and shit.
4 loadouts.
Any incident,
Oh, dude, there's
however
just, like,
trivial,
guys everywhere,
that
dude.
rouses disagreeable emotion, leaves an
What do you got,
after effect in our
35 guys?
mind, which for the time it lasts, prevents our taking a clear, objective view of the things about us,
Oh,
and tinges all our
Let's
thoughts.
go.
Just as a small object held close to the eye limits and distorts our field of vision.
Large 20 down to top. Oh,
What makes people hard-hearted is this, that each man has, or fancies he has, as much as he can bear in his own troubles. Hence, if a man suddenly finds himself in an unusually happy position, it will in most cases result in his being sympathetic and kind. But if he has never been in any other than a happy position, or this becomes his permanent state, the effect of it is often just the contrary. It so far removes him from suffering that he is incapable of feeling any more sympathy with
Yeah,
it.
let's grab that one.
So it is that the poor often show themselves more ready to help
I'm
than the
going
rich.
Right here, straight ahead. My orange thing.
At times, it seems as though we both wanted and did not want the same thing,
Double heli for
and felt at once glad and sorry about it. For instance,
Even looks like on the radar.
if on
and
some
the other
fixed
people
date
are doing
we
it.
are going to be put to a decisive test about anything in which it would be a great advantage to us to come off victorious,
Alright, which one? What do we
we shall
wanna
be
do first?
anxious
We
for
wanna
it to
do-
take place at once, and at the same time,
Alright.
we shall tremble at the
Adams
thought
are
of its
game
approach.
losers.
Let's
Alright,
just
there you
not
go.
And
hit each
if,
other, please.
in the meantime, we hear that, for once in a way, the date has been postponed, we shall experience a feeling both of pleasure and of annoyance, for the news is disappointing, but nevertheless it affords us a momentary relief. It is just the same thing if we are expecting some important letter carrying a definite decision,
I got this.
and it fails to arrive.
Hey, wait, hold on
In
one
such
second, too.
cases,
I got a sick gun for some
there are really two different motives at work in us, the stronger but more distant of the two being the desire to stand the test and to have the decision given in our favor, and the weaker, which touches us more nearly, the wish to be left for the present in peace and quiet, and accordingly,
Maybe one of you
a
drop
further
off that
enjoyment of the
Yeah.
advantage which, at any rate, attaches to a state of hopeful
Click on
uncertainty,
a bunch of recons at
compared
once
with the
so
possibility that the
yeah,
issue
you can
may be
see the other.
unfavorable.
Grab a piece of armor.
In my head, there is a permanent opposition party, and whenever I take any step or come to any decision, though I may have given the matter mature consideration, it afterwards attacks what I've done,
Oh shit.
without,
Should we do
however,
military and
being
shit
each
then?
time necessarily
see
in the
people down
right.
there?
This is, I suppose,
What about
only a
this
form
one?
of rectification on the part of the spirit of
Send me
scrutiny,
an usher by.
but it often reproaches me when I do
Yeah.
not deserve
Want
it.
to go far? Okay.
The same thing, no doubt, happens to many others as well. For where is the man who can help thinking that, after all,
Alright.
it were
thought
better
y'all were
not
going
to
to
have
that
done
close
something that he did with great deliberation?
whatever. I'm dropping on this.
Quid tam dextra
Whoa,
pede
whoa.
concipus, ut te conatus,
Nope.
No, we're
No,
fine.
just
non
stall.
that shit in a
poeni
bunch of people,
teat,
Yeah, there's dudes
votique
there, there's
paracti.
dudes there.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
not it.
Why is it that
Can't
common
be spicy.
is an expression of contempt, and that uncommon, extraordinary, distinguished, denote approbation?
Good dude right there.
Why is everything that is common contemptible?
I'm gonna drop Scott.
Common, in its original meaning,
It's everywhere,
denotes
man. That's
that
a bad
which is
spot. D, maybe get
peculiar
back in.
to all
No,
men,
dude, I got no choice,
i.e.
dude. I'm in it for.
shared
I'm in
equally
it,
by the
man.
whole
Let's go.
species, and therefore
You
an
get out.
inherent
Get
part
Ghostface.
of its nature. Accordingly, if an individual possesses no qualities beyond those which attach to mankind in general, he is a
Another one
common
here,
man.
Oh, I see.
Ordinary is a much milder word, and refers rather to intellectual character, whereas common has more of a moral application. What value can a creature have that is not a whit different from millions of its kind? Millions, do I say? Nay, an infiniture of creatures which, century after century in never-ending flow. Nature sends bubbling up from her inexhaustible springs, as generous with them as the smith with the useless sparks that fly around his
Maybe just
anvil.
keep an eye. I'm gonna jump in this.
Yeah, oh, I am.
Yes, baby, it's
It is obviously quite right that a creature which has no qualities
now?
except those of the species
okay.
should have to confine its claim to an existence entirely within the limits of the species, and live a life
Yeah,
conditioned
David,
by those
good.
limits. In various passages of my works, I have argued that whilst a lower animal possesses nothing more than the generic character of its species, man is the only being which can lay claim to possess an individual character.
Not getting shot at.
But in most men, this individual
Alright, take
character
a look.
comes to very little in reality, and they may be almost all ranged under certain classes. Ce sont des espèces. Their thoughts and desires, like their faces, are those of the species, or, at any rate, those of the class to which they belong, and accordingly, they are of a trivial, everyday, common character,
Yeah, we
and exist
should
by
buy a
the
loadout
thousand.
after this, or at least consider it.
You can usually tell beforehand what they are likely to do and say. They have no special stamp or mark to distinguish them. They are like manufactured goods,
Yeah, no,
all
it's
of
very
a
bad.
piece. If, then, their nature is merged in that of the species, how shall their existence go beyond it?
Overall.
The curse of vulgarity puts men on a par with the lower animals by allowing them none but a generic nature, a generic form of existence. Anything that is high or great or noble must then, as a matter of course, and by its very nature, stand alone in a world
Yep.
where no better expression can be found to denote what is base and contemptible than that which I have mentioned as in general use, namely, common. Will, as the thing in itself, is the foundation of all being.
Loadout?
It is
Yeah.
part and parcel of every creature,
We've
Why
got,
don't we
and a
check
permanent
these guys, see
element
if they
in
even
everything.
skill?
yeah.
Will,
If no
then,
one's shooting us at us,
is that
there,
which we
can
possess
probably-
in common with all men. Nay, with
Well,
all
I'm just looking
animals
right
and
now.
even
We've
with
got a
lower
great-
forms of
we've got a pretty
existence.
good peak.
And insofar we are akin to everything, so far that is,
Did that pretty
as
fast.
everything is
Alright, this is a
filled
good-
to overflowing
Good
with
little
will.
spot.
Yeah, so I
On the
think
other hand, that which places one being over another and sets differences between man and man is intellect and knowledge. Therefore, in every manifestation of self, we should, as far as possible,
Better click the one
give
inside
play
it.
to the intellect alone, for as we
Yeah,
have
do you want to
seen,
hit the buy first, or
the
do we
will
do
is the
recon
common
first?
part of us.
we could.
Every
You guys wanna
violent
find a
exhibition
loadout,
of
Scotty,
will
pick up
is
the recon?
common and vulgar. In other words, it reduces us to the level of the species, makes us a mere type and example of it,
Is that just on the other side?
in that it is
Whoa,
just the
gotcha.
character of the species that we are showing.
Yeah. I'm in.
So every great fit of anger is something common. Every unrestrained display of joy or of hate or of fear.
Alright, we're up and over.
In short,
Shit.
every form of emotion,
Ain't it?
in other words, every movement of the will, if it's so strong, is decidedly to outweigh the intellectual element in consciousness, and to make the man appear as a being that wills rather than knows. In giving way to emotion of this violent kind, the greatest genius puts himself on a level with the commonest son of earth. Contrarily,
Right.
if a man desires to be absolutely uncommon, in other words, great, he should never allow his consciousness to be taken possession of and dominated by the movement of his will, however much he may be solicited thereto. For example, he must be able to observe that other people are badly disposed towards him, without feeling any hatred towards them himself. Nay, there is no surer sign of a great mind than that it refuses to notice annoying and insulting expressions, but straightway ascribes them,
Put me in the fucking
as it
gulag
ascribes
already. Holy
countless other mistakes, to the defective knowledge of the speaker, and so merely observes without feeling them. This is the meaning of that remark of Gratian, that nothing is more unworthy of a man than to let it be seen that he is one. El mayor tesoro de un hombre está las muestras de que es hombre.
Man.
And even in the drama, which is the peculiar province of the passions and emotions, it is easy for them to appear common and vulgar. And this is especially observable in the works of the French tragic writers, who set no other aim before themselves but the
I dropped a
delineation
bunch
of
of
the
money if
passions.
anybody wants to grab stuff.
And
I
by
just popped my
indulging at
UAV,
one
so-
moment in a vaporous kind of pathos which makes them ridiculous, and another in
No,
epigrammatic
loadout.
witticisms,
No, because after you
endeavor
died,
to
that also
conceal
took
the
us down another
vulgarity of their
campaign.
subject. I remember seeing the celebrated Mademoiselle Rachel as
Alright,
Maria
let's
Stuart,
go,
Bunch of
and when she
fucking
burst
crazy.
out
You
in
just stay in
fury
there.
against
There's a bunch of
Elizabeth,
dudes in the next
though she did
buildings
it
over
very
there.
well, I could not help thinking of a
Can
washerwoman.
someone drop me a bit of money for some armor?
She played the final parting in such a way as to
Maya,
deprive
I
it of
kill you.
all true tragic feeling, of which
Yes.
indeed the
Yeah.
French have no notion at all.
So what are we doing? Sorry, I'm all set
Got
up now.
200 bucks.
The same
you get
part
from
was
us.
incomparably better
I'll
played
do
by
that
the
one.
Italian Ristori, and in
I
fact
think we
the
just stay in
Italian
this
nature,
building for a bit.
though in many respects very different from the German,
Well, no,
shares its appreciation for what is deep, serious, and true in art. Herein opposed to the French, which everywhere betrays that it possesses none of this feeling whatever. The noble, in other words, the uncommon element
That
in the
shoot real
drama,
close.
nay, what is sublime in it,
Yeah.
is not reached until the intellect is set
Guy
to
right
work,
behind us.
as opposed to the will, until it takes a free flight
D.
over all
Yeah,
those
right here.
passionate movements of the will and makes them subject of its contemplation.
Down.
Shakespeare, in particular, shows that this is his general method, more especially in Hamlet,
Do you guys have SMG?
and
or
only
something?
when intellect rises to the point where the
There's
vanity of
there's
all
another-
effort is manifest, and the will proceeds to an act of self-annulment, is the drama tragic in the true sense of the word. It is then that it reaches its highest aim in
I'm
becoming
gonna fucking
really
lose my
sublime.
Such a fucking waste of time.
Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world.
Guys going.
This is an error of the intellect, as inevitable as that error of the eye which
Another
lets
guy
us
here, another guy
fancy
here.
that on the horizon heaven
Doing
and
his
earth
loadout.
meet. This explains many things, and among them, the fact that everyone measures us
He's on top of your
with his
building.
own standard, generally about as long as a tailor's tape, and we have to put up with it. As also
He's one way.
that no one will allow us to be taller than himself, a
Why does
supposition
no one have money?
which is once for all taken for granted.
Yeah, I know we don't have money.
There is no doubt that many a man owes his good fortune in life solely to the circumstance that he has a pleasant way of
Are
smiling,
you guys hanging out?
and so
That'd be a
wins the
goal, or
heart
you're not hanging
in
out?
his favor.
I'm killing here.
However,
There's 2 mines in the Claymore.
the heart would do better to be careful
Guy down here.
and remember what
Got some money
Hamlet
there?
put down in his tablets, that one may smile and be a villain.
By the truck, like right there.
Yeah, he ran away.
Everything that is really fundamental in a man, and therefore genuine, works as
not to
such
get D if we need to.
unconsciously.
Oh, do you need to
In this
redeploy, D?
respect,
Yeah,
like
man.
the power of nature,
Just
that which is passed through the domain of consciousness is thereby transformed into an idea or picture. And so, if it comes to be uttered, it is only an idea or picture which passes from one person to
About one of
another.
them.
Accordingly, any quality of mind or character that is genuine and lasting is originally unconscious, and it is only when unconsciously brought into play that it makes a profound impression.
I think
If
we
any
can.
like quality is consciously exercised,
Throw it off in the car.
it means that it has been worked up. It becomes intentional,
I got
and therefore
D.
matter of
I got that.
affectation,
I got-
in other words,
Back in
of
back.
deception.
Oh, you're
Um,
back.
gotcha.
Sorry. Holy fuck.
No, it's
Yeah, we
okay.
might need a new
If a man
mission
does a
stuff.
thing unconsciously, it costs him no
I got a
trouble,
Claymore here to draw
but if he
over
tries
there.
to do it
Get
by
out that
taking
door right
trouble,
there.
he fails.
Kills.
This applies to the origin of those fundamental ideas which form the pith and marrow of all genuine work. Only that which is innate is genuine and will hold water,
Yeah, you want to
and every man who wants to achieve something, whether in practical life, in literature, or an art,
Fuck, I hate being
Got the buy
inside though.
station.
must follow the rules
I
without
think right
knowing
behind
them.
us.
That's me.
25.3.
Men
that's
of
194,
very great
is that
capacity will, as a rule, find the company of very stupid people preferable to that of the common run, for the same reason that the tyrant and the mob, the grandfather and the grandchildren, are natural allies.
Gas mask.
That
there.
line of Ovid's,
Got a gas mask.
Conaque conspectant animalia cetera terram, can be applied in its true physical sense to the lower animals alone.
No.
But in metaphorical and spiritual sense, it is, alas, true of nearly all men as well. All their plans and projects are merged in the desire of physical enjoyment, physical well-being. They may, indeed, have personal interests,
That was like
often embracing a very varied sphere, but still, these latter receive their importance entirely from the relation in which they stand to the former.
yeah, do it.
This is not only proved by their manner of life and the things they
Right
say,
there too.
but it even shows itself in the way they look,
God, let me pick
the
it up.
expression of their physiognomy, their gait and gesticulations.
Get it?
Everything about them cries out, in terram prona. It is not to them, it is only to the nobler
Yeah, we
and
should
more
probably
highly
not
endowed
have
natures,
Claymore and a
men who really
or a
think and look
rock
about them in the
star.
world and form exceptional specimens of humanity, that the next lines are applicable. Os homine sublime dedit coelumque tueri, iusit et iractos, ad sidera tolere vultus. No one knows what capacities for doing and suffering he has in himself,
How many entrances?
until something comes to rouse them to activity, just as in a pond of still water, lying there like a mirror, there is no sign of the roar and thunder with which it can leap from the precipice, and yet remain what it is, or again, rise high in the air as a fountain. When water is as cold as ice, you can have no idea of the latent warmth contained in it.
Me fucking 6 guys.
Why is it that, in spite of all the mirrors in the world, no one really knows what he looks like? A man may call to mind the face of his friend, but not his own. Here, then,
Made it.
is an initial difficulty in the way of applying the maxim, know thyself.
29.4.
This is partly, no doubt, to be explained by the fact that it is physically impossible for a man to see himself in the glass, except with face turned straight towards it and perfectly motionless. Or the expression of the eye, which counts for so much, and really gives its whole character to the face, is to a great extent lost. But coexisting with this physical impossibility, there seems to me to be an ethical impossibility of an analogous nature, and producing the same effect. A man cannot look upon his own reflection as though the person presented there were a stranger to him, and yet this is necessary if he is to take an objective view. In the last resort, an objective view means a deep-rooted feeling on the part of the individual as a moral being, that which he is contemplating is not himself.
By the buy station.
And unless he can take this point of view, he will not see things in a really true light, which is possible only if he is alive to their actual defects,
Watch out.
exactly as they are.
The walls and some of the
Instead of that, when a man sees himself in the glass,
Dude's there.
something out of his own egotistic nature whispers to him to take care to remember that it is no stranger,
Okay.
but himself that he is looking at. And this operates as a noli me tangere, and prevents him from taking an objective view. It seems, indeed, as if, without the leaven of a grain of malice, such a view were impossible.
Coast you in?
According as a man's mental energy is exerted or relaxed, will life appear to him either so short and petty and fleeting that nothing can possibly matter over which it is worth his while to spend emotion, that nothing really matters, whether it is pleasure or riches or even fame, and that, in whatever way a man may have failed, he cannot have lost much.
Or, on the other hand, life will seem so long, so important, so all in all, so momentous, and so full of difficulty, that we have to plunge into it with our whole soul if we are to obtain a share of its goods, make sure of its prizes, and carry out our plans.
That's whatever I have for right now, at least.
This latter is the imminent and common view of life. It is what Gratian means when he speaks of the serious way of looking at things. Tomar mue de veras el viver. The former is the transcendental view, which is well expressed in Ovid's Non est tanti. It is not worth so much trouble. Still better, however, by Plato's remark that nothing in human affairs is worth any great anxiety. This condition of mind is due to the intellect having got the upper hand in the domain of consciousness, where, freed from the mere service of the will, it looks upon the phenomena of life objectively, and so cannot fail to gain a clear insight into its vain and futile character. But, in the other condition of mind, will predominates, and the intellect exists
There's a guy at the back
only to light it on its way to the attainment of its desires.
Fuck.
A man is great or small, according as he leans to the one or to the other of these views of life. People of very brilliant ability think little of admitting their errors and weaknesses, or of letting others see them. They look upon them as something for which they have duly paid, and instead of fancying that these weaknesses are a disgrace to them, they consider that they are doing them an honor. This is especially the case when the errors are of the kind that hang together with their qualities, conditionis sine quibus non, or as George Sand said, les défauts de ses vertus. Contrarily,
One shot.
there are people of good character and irreproachable intellectual capacity who, far from admitting the few little weaknesses they have, conceal them with care, and show themselves very sensitive to any suggestion of their existence. And this, just because their whole merit consists in being free from error and infirmity. If these people are found to have done anything wrong, their
Alright.
reputation
There's
immediately
more.
suffers. With people of only moderate ability, modesty is mere honesty,
That's bullshit. A
but with
fucking
those who
rocket
possess
launcher
great
point
talent,
blank at his
it is
I
hypocrisy.
rocket him 3
Hence,
times.
It is
point
just
blank,
as
and he
becoming
didn't
in the
die.
latter
That guy
to
is
make
second
no
over there.
secret of the respect they bear themselves, and no disguise of the fact that they are conscious of
Um,
unusual power, as it is in the former to be modest.
Oh, it's here.
Valerius Maximus gives some very neat examples
Yeah,
of this
yeah,
in his
yeah.
chapter on self-confidence. De fiducia sui. Not to go to the theater
Kidding me?
is like making one's toilet without a mirror. But it is still worse to take a decision without consulting a friend.
No, that was,
For
actually,
a man may
yeah,
have
it
the
was
most
you.
excellent judgment in all other matters,
I can't see
and
it.
yet go wrong in those which concern himself. Because here the will comes in, and deranges the intellect at once. Therefore, let a man take counsel of a friend. A doctor can cure everyone but himself.
Oh, I had
If he
my
falls
mic
ill,
up.
he sends for a colleague.
How did that down you? The fucking roll.
In all that we do, we wish, more or less, to come to the
Yeah, I
end.
have no idea. That's true.
We are impatient to finish, and glad to be
Is there
done.
not money around there though? Like,
But the
you
last
guys
thing
shut
of
up like
all,
a fucking
the general end,
Yeah, I just ran through
is something
everyone.
that, as a rule, we wish as far off as may
One
You
guy over there,
just
you wanna
bought back.
be. Every parting gives a foretaste of death. Every coming together again, a foretaste of
Boy,
the
this is a game to
resurrection.
leave on for me though.
This is why even people
Yeah, how
who
many
were
kills you
indifferent
got?
to each other
11.
rejoice so much if they come together again
Another one
after
right there.
20 or 30 years separation.
Oh,
Oh, you guys went out.
Intellects
I went out to
differ
get-
from
try
one
and get some
another
money.
in a very real
Money
and
out there now.
fundamental way.
There
Yeah,
wasn't.
it's funny.
No
I went out
comparison
to
can well be made by
at
merely
least found the
general
dude at the fucking
observations.
thing.
It is necessary to come close and to go into
Pleasant
details.
Yeah, fucking no.
For the
joke,
difference that exists cannot be seen from afar, and it is not easy to judge by outward appearances, as in the several cases of education, leisure, and occupation. But even judging by these alone, it must be admitted that many a man has a degree of existence at least 10 times as high as another. In other words, exists 10 times as much. I am not speaking here of savages, whose life is often only 1 degree
Freedom
above
Mobile
that of
saying,
the apes
Alexa,
in
there's a
their
holiday
woods.
offer. That's what it is.
Consider, for instance, a porter in Naples or Venice in the north of Europe. Solicitude for the winter months makes people more thoughtful and therefore reflective.
Yeah, it's in the gas, so hear him cough.
Look at the life he leads, from its beginning to its end, driven by poverty, living on his physical strength, meeting the needs of every day, nay, of every hour, by hard work, great effort, constant tumult, want in all its forms, no care for the morrow, his only comfort rest after exhaustion, continuous quarreling, not a moment free for reflection. Such sensual delights as a mild climate and only just sufficient food will permit of. And then, finally, as the metaphysical element, the crass superstition of his church, the whole forming a matter of life with only a low degree of consciousness, where a man hustles, or rather is hustled, through his existence.
Alright, dudes, I got.
This restless and confused dream forms the life of how many millions? Such men think only just so much as is necessary to carry out their will for the moment. They never reflect upon their life as a connected whole, let alone, then, upon existence in general. To a certain extent, they may be said to exist without really knowing it. The existence of the mobsman, or the slave who lives on in this unthinking way, stands very much nearer than ours to that of the brute,
Tactic over here, though.
which is confined entirely to the present moment. But, for that very reason, it has also less of pain in it than ours. Nay, since all pleasure is in its nature negative, that is to say, consists in freedom from some form of misery or need, the constant and rapid interchange between setting about something and getting it done, which is the permanent accompaniment of the work they do, and then again the augmented form which this takes when they go from work to rest, and the satisfaction of their needs. All this gives them a constant source of enjoyment, and the fact that it is much commoner to see happy faces amongst the poor than amongst the rich
Sniper here.
is a sure proof that it is used to good advantage. Passing from this kind of man, consider next the sober, sensible merchant, who leads a life of speculation, thinks long over his plans and carries them out with great care, founds a house and provides for his wife, his children, and descendants. Takes his share, too, in the life of the community. It is obvious that a man like this has a much higher degree of consciousness than the former, and so his existence has a higher degree of reality. Then look at the man of learning, who investigates, it may be, the history of the past. He will have reached the point at which a man becomes conscious of existence as a whole, sees beyond the period of his own life, beyond his own personal interests, thinking over the whole course of the world's history. Then, finally, look at the poet or the philosopher, in whom reflection has reached such a height that instead of being drawn on to investigate any one particular phenomenon of existence, he stands in amazement before existence itself, this great sphinx, and makes it his problem. In him, consciousness has reached the degree of clearness at which it embraces the world itself. His intellect has completely abandoned its function as the servant of his will, and now holds the world before him, and the world calls upon him much more to examine and consider it than to play a part in it himself. If, then, the degree of consciousness is the degree of reality, such a man will be said to exist most of all, and there will be sense and significance in so describing him. Between the two extremes here sketched
fuck are they
and the
shooting
intervening stages, everyone will be able to find the place at which he himself stands.
They're just fucking camping out there for a
Is the
second.
dude right behind you?
Should we?
We know that man is in general superior to all other animals, and this is also the case in his capacity for being trained.
Got one.
Mohammedans are trained to pray with their faces turned towards Mecca 5 times a day,
How far is that zone?
and they
Yeah,
never
walk that
fail to
zone,
do
right?
it.
Yeah.
Christians are trained to cross themselves on
Also,
certain
should we just buy
occasions,
this fucking
to
ladder
bow,
right now, or
and so
no?
on.
Oh, that guy jumped off.
Indeed, it may be said that religion is the chef
He right behind
d'oeuvre
you.
of the art of training,
Deep
as it
that's
trains
pretty
people
fuck,
in
never
the
mind.
way they should think.
Didn't show me his
And, as is well known, you cannot begin the process too early. There is no absurdity so palpable but that it may be firmly planted in the human head if you only begin to inculcate it
Yeah, I did.
before the age of 5,
I'm gonna just go
by
rush him. I'm
constantly
sick of this
repeating
guy.
it with an air of great solemnity. For as in the case of animals, so in that of men, training is successful only when you begin in early youth.
He's on the other side of this building.
Noblemen and gentlemen are trained to hold nothing sacred but their word of honor, to maintain a zealous, rigid, and unshaken belief in their ridiculous code of chivalry.
Nice.
And if they are called
I
upon
don't
to
know
do
if that was
so,
you guys, but
No,
to seal
somebody
their
else killed
belief
him.
by dying for it,
another guy there.
and seriously to regard a king as a being of a higher order. Again, our expressions of politeness, the compliments we make, in particular the respectful attentions we pay to ladies, are a matter of
Yo, boy, the
training,
gas is coming in.
as also
okay.
our esteem
Let's,
for
pick
good
a place.
birth, rank,
Yeah, let's pick a
titles,
place
and so
start
on.
moving.
Of the same character is the resentment
Guy
we
just
feel
dropped
at
on
any
gas.
insult directed against
Guys
us,
on this building.
and the measure of this resentment may
Should we
be
fucking
exactly
hit this
determined
fire
by
and
the
dip?
nature of the insult. An Englishman, for instance, thinks it a deadly insult to be told that he is no gentleman, or still worse, that he is a liar.
Down
A
him?
Frenchman has the same feeling
Yeah,
if you
one
call him
over
a
here.
coward, and a
Guy
German
ran
if you
in
say
the
he is
back of the
stupid.
building. Guy over here.
There are many persons who are trained to be strictly honorable in regard to one particular matter, while they have little honor to boast of in anything
Is
else.
he around there on the ground?
Many a man, for instance, will not steal your money, but he will lay hands on everything of yours that he can enjoy without having to pay for it. A man of business will often deceive you without the slightest scruple, but he will absolutely
shot.
refuse to commit a theft.
Get him?
Yeah.
Imagination is strong in a man when that particular function of the brain which enables him to observe is roused to activity without any necessary excitement of the senses. Accordingly, we find that imagination is active just in proportion as our senses are not excited by external objects.
Alright, let's go.
A long
Yeah.
period of solitude, whether in prison or in a sick room, quiet, twilight, darkness. These are the things that promote its activity, and under their influence it comes into play
Let's go.
of itself. On the other hand, when a great deal of material is presented to our faculties of observation, as happens on a journey, or in the hurly-burly of the world, or again, in broad daylight,
You guys want to do another
the imagination is idle,
over here?
and
This
even
is
though
gonna be
call may be
coming
made
in
upon
in
it,
5 seconds,
refuses
yeah.
to become active,
Yeah, our little coming down in a second.
as though it understood that was not its proper time. However, if the imagination is to yield any real product, it must have received a great deal of material from the external world. This is the only way in which its storehouse can be filled. The fantasy is nourished much in the same way as the body, which is least capable
going
of
to
any
go.
work and enjoys
I'm not going
doing
to either.
nothing just in the very moment when it receives its food, which it has to digest.
Alright, pull up. Let's go.
And yet, it is to this very food that it owes the power which it afterwards puts forth at the right time.
Oh, Jesus.
Opinion is
Get in
like
the
a
car, everybody. Let's
pendulum
go.
and obeys the same law. If it goes past the center of gravity on one side, it must go a like distance on the other,
I'm taking a look.
and it is only after a certain time that it finds the true point
Gonna go?
at which it can remain at rest.
There.
By a process
Yeah,
of
let's
contradiction,
go straight in. That sounds pretty
distance
good.
in space makes things look small, and therefore free from defect. This is why a landscape looks so much better in a contracting mirror or in a camera obscura than it is in reality. The same effect is produced by distance in time. The scenes and events of long ago and the persons who took part
It's
in
gone, so that's
were a charming
taken.
aspect of the eye of memory, which sees only the outlines and takes no note of disagreeable details. The present enjoys no such advantage, and so it always seems defective. And again, as regards space, small objects close to us look big, and if they are very close, we may be able to see nothing else. But when we go a little way off, they become minute and invisible.
Doesn't work.
Oh no?
It is the same way again as regards time.
On purple?
The little incidents and accidents of every day fill us with emotion, anxiety, annoyance, passion, as long as they are close to us. When they appear so big, so important, so serious. But as soon as they are borne down the restless stream of time, they lose what significance they had. We think no more of them, and soon forget them altogether. They were big, only because they were near.
Yeah, sure.
Joy and sorrow are not ideas of the mind,
Then it's us, though.
but affectations of the will,
Dude there.
and so they do not lie in the domain of memory. We cannot recall our joys and sorrows, by which I mean that we cannot renew them. We can recall only the ideas that accompanied them,
Got
and in
him.
particular,
Oh, I'm down.
things we were led to say, and these form a gauge of our feelings at the time. Hence, our memory of joys and sorrows is always imperfect, and they become a matter of indifference to us as soon as they are over.
Yeah.
This explains the vanity of the attempt, which we sometimes make, to revive the pleasures and the pains of the past. Pleasure and pain are essentially an affair of the will, and the will, as such, is not possessed of memory, which is a function of the intellect. And this, in its turn, gives out and takes in nothing but thoughts and ideas, which are not here in question. It is a curious fact that in bad days we can very vividly recall the good time that is now no more,
Let's go!
but that in good days we have only a very cold and imperfect memory of the bad.
Am I good to
We have a
on
much
you guys?
better memory of actual objects or
wait.
pictures than for mere ideas. Hence, a good imagination makes it easier to learn languages, for by its aid, the new word is at once united with the actual object to which it refers. Whereas, if there is no imagination, it is simply put on a parallel with the equivalent word in the mother tongue. Mnemonics should not only mean the art of keeping something indirectly in the memory by the use of some direct pun or witticism. It should rather be applied to a systematic theory of memory, and explain its several attributes by reference both to its real nature and to the relation in which these attributes stand to one another. There are moments in life when our senses obtain a higher and rarer degree of clearness, apart from any particular occasion for it in the nature of our surroundings, inexplicable rather on physiological grounds
Lay
alone,
down, big baby.
as the result of some enhanced state of susceptibility working from within outwards.
I mean, we gotta move eventually, anyways, right?
Such moments remain indelibly impressed upon the memory, and preserve themselves in their individuality entire.
Too hot.
What about this one?
We can assign no reason for it, nor explain why this, among so many thousand moments like it, should be specially remembered. It seems as much a matter of chance as when single specimens of a whole race of animals now extinct are discovered in the layers of a rock,
Whoa, 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 whoa.
or when, on opening a book, we light upon an insect
I have no idea.
accidentally crushed within the
Right
leaves.
outside.
Memories of this kind are always sweet and pleasant.
Team wipe?
Yeah.
It occasionally happens
Fuck, that
that,
trophy just saved
for no
the fuck
particular
out of us, so
reason,
he shot 2 at us.
long-forgotten scenes suddenly start up in the memory.
Alright, let's
This
go.
may
Thank
in
you,
many
guys.
cases be due to the action of some hardly perceptible odor, which accompanied those
Maya, what
scenes
do you
and now
mean?
recurs exactly same as
Oh,
before.
you need to pee? Oh,
For it is well known
You're just gonna have to wait.
that the sense of smell is specially effective in awakening memories,
You think this bias
and that in
is
general, it does not
I don't know,
require
it
much
looks
to
like-
rouse a train of ideas. And I may say, in passing, that the sense of sight is connected with the understanding, the sense of hearing with the reason, and as we see in the present case, the sense of smell with the memory. Touch and taste are more material and dependent upon contact.
That's all I got.
They have no ideal side.
Jesus Christ, drop my stack.
It must also be reckoned among the peculiar attributes of memory that a slight state of intoxication often so greatly enhances the recollection of past times and scenes that all the circumstances connected with them come back much more clearly than would be possible in a state of sobriety, but that, on the other
Can you
hand,
just hold on?
the recollection of what one said or did while the intoxication lasted is more than usually imperfect.
I
Nay,
need one, yeah.
that if one has been absolutely tipsy,
Don't have money,
it is
though.
gone altogether. We may say, then, that
Might
whilst
have a couple of
intoxication enhances the memory for what is past, it allows it to remember a little of the
We
present.
gotta make a move, though.
Yeah.
Or
Men
stay
need some kind of external activity
We're in the zone.
because they
We're
are
about
inactive within.
here. Good night, some people.
Contrarily,
Buy station.
if they are active within,
You can't
they
just
do not
buy
care
and
to be
just
dragged
fucking
out of
go
themselves. It
Yeah. Is there
disturbs
an
and
upstairs on
impedes
this?
their thoughts in a
Yeah,
way that
okay.
is
I'm down for that.
often most ruinous to them.
Right on top of the fire station.
I am not surprised that some people are bored when they find themselves alone,
Want to take that
for they
house?
cannot
Be a
laugh
cross
if they are
for
quite by
buy station
themselves.
upgrade.
Oh yeah, true.
The very
Do that.
idea of
Maybe
it
2 and 2?
seems folly to them.
I'll go to the other side.
I'm trying to kill this guy.
Are we, then, to look upon laughter as merely a signal for others, a mere sign, like a word? What makes it impossible for people to laugh when they are alone is nothing but want of imagination, dullness of mind generally.
Claymore on the stairs.
Anastasia
Yeah, I got eyes on
kai
the Y.
bradutes tsukes,
Oh, nice.
as Theophrastus has
Maya,
it.
you
Well,
gotta
I'm
wait,
just
you gotta
fire,
wait, you gotta wait, just wait.
The lower
5
animals
minutes.
never laugh, either alone or in company. Myson, the misanthropist, was once surprised by one of these people as he was laughing to himself. "Why do you laugh?" he asked. "There is no one with you." "That is just why I am laughing," said Myson. Natural gesticulation, such as commonly
I do, yeah.
accompanies any lively talk, is a language of its own. More widespread even than the language of words, so far, I mean, as it is independent of words and alike in all nations. It is true that nations make use of it in proportion as they are vivacious, and that,
put
in
claymores on
particular
the door, is that
cases,
correct, Scott?
amongst the Italians for instance,
Put one on the
it
stairs.
is supplemented by certain
Okay,
peculiar
okay.
gestures which
That's
are
perfect,
merely
that's even
conventional,
better.
and therefore possessed of nothing
Maya,
more
come
than a local value.
We'll go for a walk in 1 second, okay, baby?
In the universal use made of it, gesticulation has some analogy with logic and grammar,
Needy girl.
in that it has to do with the form rather than with the matter of conversation. But on the other hand, it is distinguishable from them by the fact that it has more of a moral than of an intellectual bearing. In other words, it reflects the movements of the will. As an accompaniment of conversation, it is like the bass of a melody, and if, as in music, it keeps true to the progress of the treble, it serves to heighten the effect. In a conversation, the gesture depends upon the form in which the subject matter is conveyed, and it is interesting to observe that,
Kinda like it.
whatever that
The whip
subject
we
matter may
have
be,
too.
Yeah.
with a recurrence of the form, the very same gesture is repeated.
Maya, let go.
E in them, that may be
So if I happen to see, from my window say, 2 persons carrying on a lively conversation without my being able to catch a word, I can, nevertheless, understand the general nature of it perfectly well.
Maya, enough. Get
I mean,
down.
the kind of thing that is being said and the form it takes.
Maya, I'm gonna put
There is
you
no
in
mistake
pen.
about
Stop
it. The speaker is arguing about something, advancing his
fucking fighting me,
reasons,
man.
then
She's fucking
limiting their
fighting me.
application, then driving them home and drawing the conclusion in triumph. Or he is recounting his experiences, proving, perhaps, beyond the shadow of a doubt, how much he has been injured, but bringing the clearest and most damning evidence to show that his opponents were foolish and obstinate people who would not be convinced. Or else, he is telling of the splendid plan he laid and how he carried it to a successful issue, or perhaps failed because the luck was against him.
Okay, car's pulling up, I'm
Or,
guaranteeing
it
you.
may be, he is saying that he was completely at a loss to know what to do,
Oh,
or that he was quick in seeing some traps set for him, and that by insisting on his rights, or by applying a little force, he succeeded in frustrating and punishing his enemies, and so on, in hundreds of cases of a similar kind.
Yo, do you have any sniper while we're here?
Strictly speaking, however, what I get from gesticulation alone is an abstract notion of the essential drift of what is being said, And that, too,
Yeah,
whether I judge from a moral or an intellectual point of view,
I need SMG.
it is the quintessence, the true substance of the conversation.
Oh, no, I don't need it.
And this remains identical, no matter what may have given rise to the conversation, or what it may be about. The relation between the two being that of a general idea or class name to the individuals which it covers.
Yeah, it's funny, we were talking about
Some
that.
shit in yours?
As I've said,
The whip up there.
the most interesting and amusing part of the matter is the complete identity and solidarity of the gestures used to denote the same set of circumstances,
What?
even though by people of very different temperament,
I think the Bison has
so that the gestures become exactly like words of a language, alike for everyone, and subject only to such small modifications as depend upon variety of accent and
Alright,
education.
another whip coming.
And yet,
They're 100%.
there can be no doubt
No?
but that these standing
We got our
gestures,
whip too,
which
yeah.
everyone uses,
Yeah.
are the result of no convention or collusion. They are original and
Seems like
innate,
definitely going
a
up and
true
going down
language
there
of
or
nature.
something.
Yeah.
Consolidated, it may be, by imitation and the influence of custom.
Fuck.
It is well known that it is part of an
This
actor's
egg.
duty to make a careful study
Yeah,
of
let's take that
gesture,
egg.
and the same thing is true, to a somewhat
And the
small
whip.
degree, of a public speaker.
Maybe some in the whip and some in the...
This study must consist
just
chiefly in
down
watching
there.
others and
I'm just gonna
imitating
get
their
this whip with
movements,
Where are we
whoever.
going? I'm gonna
for there are no
walk.
abstract
We're going
rules
green.
fairly applicable to the matter, with the
Oh,
exception
shit,
of
red
some
zombie.
very general leading
I see you.
principles, such as, to take an example,
So they might be in that... they
that
might
the
be in
gesture
that-
must not follow the word, but rather come immediately before it, by way of announcing its approach and attracting the hearer's attention.
Oh.
That's the fire station.
Englishmen entertain a peculiar
Yep, they're in here.
contempt for gesticulation, and look upon it as
Or
something vulgar and undignified.
There's nobody in this building
This
that I'm
seems
in.
to me a silly prejudice on their part, and the outcome of their general prudery. For here we have a language which nature has given to everyone, and which everyone understands, and to do away with and forbid it for no better reason than that it is opposed to that much lauded
Keep your head out
thing,
again, you little
gentlemanly
fucking
feeling,
Oh, he's up in the tower
is a very
too?
questionable proceeding.
Come on,
The human
Percy.
intellect
Peek
is
your
said
head,
to
you
be so
fucking-
constituted
Oh.
that general ideas arise by abstraction from particular observations, and therefore come after them in point of
Alright guys,
time.
there's dudes over here, eh?
If this is what actually occurs, as happens in the case of a man who has to depend solely upon his own experience for what he learns, who has no teacher and no book, such a man knows quite well which of his particular observations belong to and are represented by each of his general ideas. He has a perfect acquaintance with both sides of his experience,
Yeah, there's...
and accordingly he treats everything that comes in his way from a right standpoint. This might be called the natural method of education. Contrarily, the artificial method is to hear what other people say, to learn
Down.
and to read, and so to get your head crammed full of general ideas before you have any sort of extended acquaintance with the world as it is, and as you may see it for yourself.
Oh man.
You will be told that the particular observations which go to make these general ideas will come to you later on in the course of experience.
Little shed. Oh.
But until that time arrives, you apply your ideas wrongly. You judge men and things from a wrong standpoint, you see them in a wrong light, and treat them in a wrong way.
Down.
So it is that education perverts the mind.
Yeah, that was my fault. I thought.
This explains why it so frequently happens
I
that,
heard you go to the
after a
front,
long
I thought
course
you
of
guys
learning and
were
reading,
leaving,
we enter upon the world in our youth,
Yo.
partly with an artless ignorance of things,
There's a guy
partly
out
with
there.
wrong notions about
Yeah.
them,
but- Very right, that's how my shit.
So that our demeanor serves at one moment of a nervous anxiety,
and another of a mistaken confidence.
Fuck, I need to armor up, sorry.
Yeah, armor.
The reason of this is simply that our head is full of general ideas which we are now trying to turn to some use, but which we hardly ever apply rightly.
Kinda fucked though.
This is the result of acting in direct opposition to the natural development of the mind by obtaining general ideas first, and particular observations last. It is putting the cart before the horse. Instead of developing the child's own faculties of discernment and teaching it to judge and think for itself, the teacher uses all his energies to stuff its head full of the ready-made thoughts of other people. The mistaken views of life, which spring from a false application of general ideas, have afterwards to be corrected by long years of experience, and it is seldom that they are wholly corrected. This is why so few men of learning are possessed of common sense, such as is often to be met with in people who have had no instruction at all.
To acquire a knowledge of the world might be defined as the aim of all education,
Jumped out.
and it follows from what I have said that special stress should be laid upon beginning to acquire this knowledge at the right end.
Wanted there.
As I have shown, this means in the main that the particular observation of a thing shall precede the general idea of it. Further, that narrow and circumscribed ideas shall come before ideas of a wide range. It means, therefore, that the whole system of education shall follow in the steps that must have been taken by the ideas themselves in the course of their formation. But whenever any of these steps are skipped or left out,
Alright.
the instruction is defective and the ideas obtained are false. And finally, a distorted view of the world arises, peculiar to the individual himself. A view such as almost everyone entertains for some time, and most men for as long as they live. No one can look into his own mind without seeing that it was only after reaching a very mature age, and in some cases when he least expected it, that he came to a right understanding, or a clearer view of many matters in his life, that after all, were not very difficult or complicated. Up till then, there were points in his knowledge of the world which were still obscure, due to his having skipped some particular lesson in those early days of his education, whatever it may have been like, whether artificial
Actually, he's going
or conventional,
the other way, so
or of that natural
disregard
kind
him.
which is based upon individual experience. It follows that an attempt should be made to find out the strictly natural course of knowledge, so that education may proceed methodically by
Dude's
keeping
coming
to
right
it,
here.
and that children may become acquainted with the ways of the world without getting wrong ideas into their head, which very often cannot be got out again.
Where is that guy?
If this plan were adopted,
There's a
special
dude
care would
just
have to be
laid
taken
right
to prevent
there.
children from using words without clearly understanding their meaning and application. The fatal tendency to be satisfied with words instead of trying to understand things, to learn phrases by heart so that they may prove a refuge in time of need, exists as a rule, even in children, and the tendency lasts on into manhood, making the knowledge of many learned persons to consist in mere verbiage.
When we blew up the chopper last
However,
that's
the main endeavor must always be to let particular observations precede general ideas, and not vice versa,
That pissed
as
me
is
off so
usually
much.
and unfortunately the case.
Oh, I know.
As though a child should come feet foremost into the world, or a verse be begun by writing down the rhyme. The ordinary method is to imprint ideas and opinions, in the strict sense of the word, prejudices, on the mind of the child, before it has had any but very few particular observations. It is thus that he afterwards comes to view the world and gather experience through the medium of those ready-made ideas, rather than to let his ideas be formed for him out of his own experience of life, as they ought to be. A man sees a great many things when he looks at the world for himself, and he sees them from many sides. But this method of learning is not nearly so short or so quick as the method which employs abstract ideas and makes hasty generalizations about everything.
Yep.
I get shot at.
Experience, therefore, will be a long time in correcting preconceived ideas, or perhaps never bring its task to an end. For wherever a man finds that the aspect of things seems to contradict the general ideas he has formed, he will begin by rejecting the evidence it offers as partial and one-sided. Nay, he will shut his eyes to it altogether, and deny that it stands in any contradiction at all with his preconceived notions, in order that he may thus preserve them uninjured. So it is that many a man carries about a burden of wrong notions all his life long, crotchets, whims, fancies, prejudices, which at last become fixed ideas.
It worked really good for us
The fact is that he has never tried to form his fundamental ideas for himself out of his own experience of life, his own way of looking at the world, because he has taken over his ideas ready-made from other people, and this it is that makes him, as it makes many others, so shallow and superficial. Instead of that method of instruction, care should be taken to educate children on the natural lines.
So I need to try and get a gun here.
No idea should ever be established in a child's mind otherwise than by what the child can see for itself. Or at any rate, it should be verified by the same means. And the result of this would be that the child's ideas, if few, would be well-grounded and accurate. It would learn how to measure things by its own standard rather than by another's, and so it would escape 1,000 strange fancies and prejudices,
and not need to have them eradicated by the lessons it will subsequently be taught in the school of life.
Gonna take that armor in
The
there?
child would, in this way, have its mind once
fuck yeah.
for all habituated to clear views and thoroughgoing knowledge. It would use its own judgment and take an unbiased estimate of things. And, in general, children should not form their notions of what life is like from the copy before they have learned it from the original, to whatever aspect of it their attention may be directed. Instead, therefore, of hastening to place books, and books alone, in their hands, let them be made acquainted step by step with things, with the actual circumstances of human life.
Getting real choppy right now.
And above all, let care be taken to
Yeah,
bring
I
them
noticed
to a
that we
clear
had a big
and
ping
objective
drop in
view of the
fucking,
world as it is, to educate them
Ellie.
always to derive their ideas directly from real life and to shape them in conformity with it,
There's
not
another
to
one
fetch
with a
them
red
from other
message
sources,
here.
such as books, fairy tales, or what people say, than to apply them ready-made to real life,
Spin again!
for this will mean that their heads are full of wrong
The
notions,
other one?
and that they will either see things in a false light or try in vain to remodel the world to suit their views,
Yeah, let's go in.
Got it.
and so enter upon false
And
paths.
there's one in farm as well.
And that, too, whether they are only constructing theories of life or engaged in the actual business of it. It is incredible how much harm is done when the seeds of wrong notion are laid in the mind in those early years, later on to bear a crop of prejudice. For the subsequent lessons, which are learned from real life in the world, have to be devoted mainly to their extirpation.
We all don't.
To unlearn the evil, was the answer, according to Diogenes Laertius. Antisthenes gave, when he was asked what branch of knowledge was most necessary. And we can see what he meant.
Wanna go get that other one? Yeah.
No child under the age of 15 should receive instruction in subjects which may possibly be the vehicle of serious error, such as philosophy, religion, or any other branch of knowledge where it is necessary to take large views, because wrong notions imbibed early can seldom be rooted out, and of all the intellectual faculties, judgment is the last one to arrive at
That
maturity.
just disappeared.
Yep, it did.
The child should give its attention either to subjects where no error is possible at all,
No, we don't.
such as
We need to-
mathematics,
We kind of know
or to
exactly
those in
that.
which there is no
Well, you
particular
click that buy
danger in
thing,
making a
right?
mistake, such as languages, natural science, history, and so
Buy the
on.
loadout. Yeah, I'll buy
And
it.
in general, the branches of knowledge which are to be studied at any period of life should be such as the mind is equal to at that period and can perfectly understand.
Self-revise.
Childhood and youth form the time for collecting materials, for getting a special and thorough
Somebody
knowledge of
drop
the
me,
individual
21
and
so I
particular
can get
things.
UAV if you have it.
In those years, it is too early to form views on a large scale,
Okay, let me get to
and
it.
ultimate explanations must be put off to a later date. The faculty of judgment, which cannot come into play without mature experience, should be left to itself,
There.
and care should be taken not to anticipate its action by inculcating prejudice, which will paralyze it forever. On the other hand,
There's
the
another
memory
team
should
over
be
here with
specially
the chopper,
taxed in
huh?
youth, since it is then that it is strongest and most tenacious.
They're doing recon.
But in
as well.
choosing the
There's another
things that should be
fucking
committed to
chopper there.
memory, the utmost care and forethought must be exercised, as lessons well learnt in youth are never forgotten. This precious soil must therefore be cultivated so as to bear as much
Do a little
fruit as
flyby
possible.
first,
If you think how
Where do you-
deeply rooted in your
Oh,
memory
I see.
are those
So
persons
this is
whom
an
you
enemy
knew
heli.
in the first 12 years of your life,
Yeah.
how indelible the impression made upon you by the events of those years,
All over there.
By their loadout.
how clear your recollection of most of the things that happened to you then, most of what was told or taught you. It will seem a natural thing to take the susceptibility and tenacity of the mind at that period as the groundwork of education.
Oh, the chopper's back.
This may be done by a strict observance of method
D don't go. I
and
don't
a
know if you wanna
systematic
go.
regulation of the
D, you can
impressions
take this, though.
which the mind is to receive.
What are we doing here?
But the years of youth allotted to a man are short,
Yeah.
and memory is, in general, bound within narrow limits, still more so, the memory of any one individual.
I got the right.
Since this is the case, it is all important to fill the memory with what is essential and material in any branch of knowledge, to the exclusion of everything else.
Yeah, for sure.
The decision as to what is essential and material should rest with the masterminds in every department of thought.
Oh, fuck, I have no
Their
ammo.
choice should be made after the most mature deliberation, and the outcome of it
Bullets.
fixed and determined. Such a
Oh, yeah,
choice
dude,
would
I-
have to proceed by sifting the things
Long
which it
shot.
is necessary and
I
important
don't
for a man
understand,
to
but I
know in
didn't
general,
get the
and then,
go for it.
necessary and important for him to know in any particular business or calling.
I got one of them.
Knowledge of the first kind would have to be classified after an encyclopedic fashion in graduated courses, adapted to the degree of general culture which a man may be expected to have in the circumstances in which he is placed. Beginning with a course limited to the necessary requirements of primary education and extending upwards to the subjects treated in all of the branches of philosophical thought. The regulation of the second kind of knowledge would be left to those who had shown genuine mastery in the several departments into which it is divided, and the whole system would provide an elaborate rule or canon for intellectual education, which would of course have to be revised every 10 years. Some such arrangement as this would employ the youthful power of the memory to best advantage, and supply excellent working material to the faculty of judgment when it made its appearance later on.
I'm going where Adam is.
A man's knowledge may be said to be mature. In other words, it has reached the most complete state of perfection to which he, as an individual, is capable of bringing it, when an exact correspondence is established between the whole of his abstract ideas and the things he has actually perceived for himself. This will mean that each of his abstract ideas rests, directly or indirectly, upon a basis of observation, which alone endows it with any real value, and also that he is able to place every observation he makes under the right abstract idea which belongs to it. Maturity is the work of experience alone, and therefore it requires time. The knowledge we derive from our own observation is usually distinct from that which we acquire through the medium of abstract ideas, the one coming to us in the natural way, the other by what people tell us, and the course of instruction we receive, whether it is good or bad. The result is that in youth there is generally very little agreement or correspondence between our abstract ideas, which are merely phrases in the mind, and that real knowledge which we have obtained by our own observation. It is only later on that a gradual approach takes place between these two kinds of knowledge, accompanied by a mutual correction of error, and knowledge is not mature until this coalition is accomplished. This maturity or perfection of knowledge is something quite independent of another kind of perfection, which may be of a high or a low order. The perfection, I mean, to which a man may bring his own individual faculties, which is measured not by any correspondence between the two kinds of knowledge, but by the degree of intensity which each kind attains. For the practical man, the most needful thing is to acquire an accurate and profound knowledge of the ways of the world. But this, though the most needful, is also the most wearisome of all studies, as a man may reach a great age without coming to the end of his task. Whereas in the domain of the sciences, he masters the more important facts when he is still young. In acquiring that knowledge of the world, it is while he is a novice, namely in boyhood and in youth, that the first and hardest lessons are put before him. But it often happens that even in later years there is still a great deal to be learned. The study is difficult enough in itself, but the difficulty is doubled by novels, which represent a state of things in life and the world, such as, in fact, does not exist. Youth is credulous and accepts these views of life, which then become part and parcel of the mind, so that instead of merely negative condition of ignorance, you have positive error, a whole tissue of false notions to start with. And at a later date, these actually spoil the schooling of experience, put a wrong construction on the lessons it teaches. If, before this, the youth had no light at all to guide him, he is now misled by a will-o'-the-wisp. Still more often is this the case with a girl. They have both had a false view of things foisted on them by reading novels, and expectations have been aroused which can never be fulfilled. This generally exercises a baneful influence on their whole life. In this respect, those whose youth has allowed them no time or opportunity for reading novels, those who work with their hands and the like, are in a position of decided advantage. There are a few novels to which this reproach cannot be addressed, which have an effect the contrary of bad. First and foremost, to give an example, Gil Blas and the other works of Le Sage, or rather their Spanish originals. Further, The Vicar of Wakefield, and to some extent, Sir Walter Scott's novels. Don Quixote may be regarded as a satirical exhibition of the error to which I am referring.
Kill that guy.
Schiller's poem in honor of women,
Down one guy.
Würde
Yeah,
der
one guy.
Frauen,
Sucking dick.
is the
You
result of
fucking
much
bitch,
careful
you
thought,
fucking pussy.
and it appeals to the reader by its antithetic
Whoa,
style
gee.
and its
You're
use
gonna
of
have some
contrast.
violent lovemaking.
But as an expression of the true praise which should be accorded to them, it is, I think, inferior to these few
I
words of
just checked it
joy.
out as I dropped in.
Without women,
Yeah.
I didn't see
the beginning of
anything
our
else
life
going
would be
on here.
helpless,
I'm gonna try and
the
get my
middle
load out.
devoid of pleasure,
Go for it.
and the end
Going to
of
buy another
consolation.
I don't know how the fuck. I mean, I guess I got money.
The same thing is more feelingly expressed by Byron
There wasn't
in
much. I got
Sardanapalus.
5,500. I just bought a UAV. Fuck, sorry, you guys need
The very
help and
first
shit?
of
No
human
problem.
life
doesn't
must
matter, dude.
spring from woman's
You
breast.
take this money, Adam, behind you.
Your first small words are taught you from her lips.
Oh, I need another
Your
truck,
first
too.
tears
That's
quenched
stupid.
by her, and your last sighs, too often, breathed out in a woman's hearing, when men have shrunk from the ignoble care of watching the last hour of him
Yeah,
who
that's
led
yours.
them. Act 1, Scene 2.
Armor here, 2 plates.
These
Another-
two
another
passages
dude coming
indicate
right
the
here, you
right
see that?
standpoint for the appreciation of women. You need only look at the way in which she is
I don't
formed to
think he's
see
actually
that
coming for the-
woman is not meant to undergo great labor,
got
whether of
shot
the
at.
mind or of the body. She pays the debt of life not by what she does, but by what she suffers, by the pains of childbearing and the care for the child, and by submission to her husband, to whom she should be a patient and cheering companion. The keenest sorrows and joys are not for
Should
her,
we chase after him?
nor is she called upon to display a great deal of strength.
Moving to
The current of her
circle,
life
you
should
wanna
be
keep,
more gentle,
camping on the buy
peaceful,
station.
and trivial than man's.
Well,
Without
I mean,
being
we have
essentially
this
happier
and
or
this that are
unhappier.
Two options.
Women are directly fitted for acting as the
And-
nurses and teachers of our early childhood, by the
Probably
fact
make a
that
move
they
to this
are
one at
themselves
least.
childish, frivolous,
I
and
need
short-sighted.
more ammo.
In a word, they are
Yeah,
big
at
children
least.
all their life long,
And then we can
kind of intermediate stage between the child and the full-grown man, who
Yeah, I
is
probably
man in
do.
the strict
Just
sense of the word.
wait till we get to the
There's no
spot.
extra over
See how
here.
a girl will fondle a child for days together, dance with
Oh,
it,
yeah.
and sing to it,
There's some.
and then think what a
Crazy
man,
here.
with the best will in the world, could do
Oh, awesome.
if he were put in her place.
A bunch of shit there. I got
With
some,
young
I picked up some
girls,
ammo, too.
nature seems to have had in view what, in the language of drama,
Got a
is
gas
called
mask here as
a
well.
striking effect. As for a few years, she dowers them with a wealth of beauty and is
So we're
lavish
in
in her
purple.
gift of
That's
charm,
Armor.
at the expense of all the rest of their
I also have
life,
a UAV too.
so
Like, I
that
think
during those
this-
years they may
no,
capture
that's
the
out of the
fantasy
zone.
of some
These-
man to
every
such a degree that he is
place in
hurried
here
away
is not
into
an actual
undertaking
spot,
the
you know that?
honorable care
I
of
think
them
this is the best
in
one.
some form or another, as long as
Yeah,
they
I do
live.
too.
A step for
And
which
that is
there would
just
not
like
appear
a-
to be any
so-
sufficient warranty
like a
if reason
shed.
alone directed his
Got
thoughts.
some traps in and
Accordingly, nature has equipped woman, as she does all her creatures,
I got
with the
mine
weapons
back
and
here.
implements requisite for the safeguarding of her existence, and for just as long as it is necessary for her to have them. Here, as elsewhere, nature proceeds with her usual economy, for just as the female ant, after fecundation, loses her wings,
Although-
which are then superfluous,
You
nay,
know, it would be a good
actually a
spot.
danger to the business of
Walking
breeding.
back around, like after.
So, after giving birth to
Walking
one or
back
two
around
children,
here and
a
getting
woman
up to the
generally
top of that.
loses her beauty, probably indeed for similar reasons.
Yeah, but then we like.
And
look
so
how
we
wide
find
the
that young
circle
girls
is
in
on
their
the
hearts
back end.
look upon domestic
We got a lot of
affairs
room
or
for
work
people
of
to
any
come in
kind
here.
as
We pretty much
of
would have to go
secondary
all the way
importance,
back to here.
if not actually as a mere jest.
Not the worst, though. We have to
The only
leave this
business that
till
really
the
claims their
sun's
earnest
high.
attention is love, making conquests and everything connected with this, dress, dancing, and so
No,
on.
I'm saying like in a bit though. Like
A nobler and more perfect a thing is, the later and slower it is in arriving at maturity.
oh shit,
A
those
man
dudes are back.
reaches the maturity of his reasoning powers and mental faculties
Jump, you pussy.
hardly before the age of 28. A woman at 18. And then, too, in the case of woman, it is only reason of a sort,
Northwest.
very niggard in its dimensions. That is why women remain children their whole life long, never seeing anything but what is quite close to them, cleaving to the present moment, taking appearance for reality, and preferring trifles to matters of the first importance. For it is by virtue of his reasoning faculty that man does not live in the present only, like the brute,
I have no idea
but
where you
looks
went.
about him, and considers the
sounds like there's a bunch
past
of
and the
bullets
future,
going there.
and this is the origin of prudence, as well as of that care and anxiety which so many people exhibit.
One guy in there is I'm talking to
Both the
Down there,
advantages
another guy
and the
over there.
disadvantages which this involves
Fuck this.
are shared in by the woman to a smaller extent because of her weaker power of reasoning.
Fuck, I almost got a wall bang.
She may in fact be described as intellectually short-sighted, because while she has an intuitive understanding of what lies quite close to her, her field of vision is narrow and does not reach to what is remote, so that things which are absent or past or to come have much less effect on women than upon
Yes, I
men.
do. Yeah. Come on down.
This is the reason why women are more often inclined to be extravagant, and sometimes carry their inclination to a length that borders upon madness.
Oh no, I don't actually. Sorry.
In their hearts,
I've got
women
I've
think
got
that it is
shotgun and
men's
SMG.
business to earn money and theirs to spend it,
You actually.
if possible during their husband's life, but at any rate after his death.
Good idea.
Be careful, because
The
there's
very
a guy over
fact that their husband hands them over his earnings for purposes of housekeeping strengthens
More
them
guys
in
were
this
starting to
belief.
appear on the heartbeat. I think there's another squad of them.
However many disadvantages all this may involve,
You need
there is at least this to be said in its favor,
Thank you.
that the woman lives more in the present than the man, and that, if the present is at all tolerable, she enjoys it more eagerly.
and everyone has.
This is the main source of that cheerfulness which is peculiar to women, fitting her to amuse man in his hours of recreation, and, in case of need, to console him when he is borne down by the weight of his cares. It is by no means a bad plan to consult women in matters of difficulty, as the Germans used to do in ancient times, for their way of looking at things is quite different from ours, chiefly in the fact that they like to take the shortest way to their goal, and in general manage to fix their eyes upon what lies before them, while we, as a rule, see far beyond it, just because it is in front of our noses. In cases like this, we need to be brought back to the right standpoint, so as to recover the near and simple view. Then, again, women are decidedly more sober in their judgment than we are,
that first
so
loadout.
that they do not see more in things than is really there, whilst, if our passions are aroused, we are
Anyone got a
apt to
trophy?
see things in an exaggerated way, or imagine what does not exist. The weakness of their reasoning faculty also explains why it is that women show more sympathy for the unfortunate than men do, and so treat them with more kindness and interest, and why it is that, on the contrary, they are inferior to men in point of justice, and less honorable and conscientious. For it is just because their reasoning power is weak that present circumstances have such a hold over them, and those concrete things which lie directly before their eyes exercise a power which is seldom counteracted to any extent by abstract principles of thought,
Nice whenever.
by fixed rules of conduct, firm resolutions, or, in general, by consideration for the past and the future, or regard for what is absent and remote. Accordingly,
Oh.
they possess the first and main elements that go to make a virtuous character, but they are deficient in those secondary qualities, which are often a necessary instrument in the formation of it. Footnote.
Guy.
In this respect, they may be compared to an animal organism which
What's the move
contains a
from here, though,
liver
boys?
but no gallbladder.
Yeah, we do have to
Here,
watch out.
let me refer to
think
what I
we're
have said
guys
in
in
the
there.
treatise on the foundations
way?
of morals,
When it
section
closes, yeah.
17. End footnote. Hence, it will be found that the fundamental fault of the female character
Or do we
is that it
stay
has
down?
no sense of justice. This is mainly due to the fact, already
The high
mentioned,
ground
that
where
women are
boss usually
defective
get on
in the
the low
powers of
ground.
reasoning and deliberation. But it is also
make it quick,
traceable
though.
to the position which nature has assigned to them as the weaker sex.
Oh shit.
They are
No, don't come
dependent
up.
not
Dude
upon
over here.
strength, but upon craft, and hence their instinctive capacity for cunning, and their ineradicable tendency to say what is not true. For, as lions are provided with claws and teeth, and elephants
There's
and
a
boars
dude
with
over on this
tusks,
one.
bulls with horns, and cuttlefish with its clouds of inky fluid, so nature has equipped woman for her defense and protection with the arts of dissimulation, and all the power which nature has conferred upon man in the shape of physical strength and reason has been bestowed upon woman in this form. Hence,
Yo,
dissimulation
fuck,
is innate in
gotta
women,
watch
and almost as much
our
a
heads,
quality of the
because
stupid
there's
as of
definitely
the
dudes that are gonna
clever.
be coming on top of us here.
It is as natural for them to make use of it on every occasion as it is for those
Guys
animals
to
to
our
employ
right,
their
Scott.
means of defense when they
Yeah.
are attacked.
He's alone. The rest
They have
of
a
his buddies
feeling
got
that,
smoked.
in doing so,
Should we try and
they are
get
only
behind that
within their
building then?
rights. Therefore,
wanna rush him?
a woman who is perfectly truthful and not given to dissimulation is perhaps an impossibility,
Stop from the other way?
and for this very
Yeah,
reason,
that's from the top.
they are so quick at seeing through dissimulation in others that it is not a wise thing to attempt it with them.
Get in.
Gotta run.
But this fundamental defect which I have stated, with all that it entails, gives rise to falsity, faithlessness, treachery, ingratitude, and so on.
We lost this
Perjury
game
in a
before.
court of justice is more often committed by women than by men. It may indeed be generally questioned whether women ought to be sworn in at all. From time to time, one finds repeated cases everywhere of ladies who want for nothing, taking things from shop counters when no one is looking,
Got armor on?
making off with them.
Fuck. The us versus 4.
Yeah.
Nature has
down,
appointed
and
that
there was,
the
like,
propagation of the
another
species shall be the business of men
Fencing all around. I
who are
was like, right down
young,
the creek,
strong,
it was
and
long, but I
handsome,
couldn't move.
so
I
that the
got this
race
door, you
may
get
not
the window.
degenerate. This is the firm
They got
will
a
and
full
purpose of
guy.
nature in regard to the species, and it finds its expression in the
not?
passions of women. There is no law that is older or more powerful than this. Woe, then,
How in the fuck
the
is
man
he
who
giving
sets
us
up
another
claims and
puzzle?
interests that will conflict with it. Whatever he may say and do, they will be unmercifully crushed at the first serious
Guys,
encounter.
silence, Adam.
For the innate rule that governs women's conduct, though
Honestly,
it is
that's
secret
fucking clown
and
bullshit.
unformulated, nay, unconscious in its working, is this. We are justified in deceiving those who think they have acquired rights over the species by paying little attention to the individual. That is, to us. The Constitution, and therefore the welfare of the species, have been placed in our hands and committed to our care through the control we obtain over the next generation, which proceeds from us. Let us discharge our duties conscientiously. But women have no abstract knowledge of this leading principle. They are conscious of it only as a concrete fact,
But let's not take this
and they have no
scavenger.
other
Let's
method
take
of
the two
giving
helis
expression
and then
to
get
it
out.
than the way in which they act when the opportunity arrives. And then, their conscience does not trouble them so much as we fancy. For in the darkest recesses of their heart, they are aware that in committing a breach of their duty towards the individual, they have all the better fulfilled their duty towards the species, which is infinitely greater.
That didn't work.
And since women exist in the main solely for the propagation of the species and are not destined for anything else, they live as a rule more for the species than for the individual,
Got it.
and in their hearts
Okay, where are
take
you
the
guys?
affairs of the species more seriously than
I'm
those
up
of the
top
individual.
B.
This gives their whole life and being a certain levity. The general bent of their character
I thought you
is
guys
in a
got beat
direction
on that
fundamentally
shit.
different
No
from
way,
that of
man.
man, and it is
Scotty
this
Pink.
which produces that discord in married life, which is so frequent, almost the normal state.
Whatever, let's go
The
somewhere
natural
else. Guys,
feeling
right now.
between men is
Yep.
mere
Yeah,
indifference,
I'm looking.
but between women, it is actual enmity.
Oh, missile locking. I'm out.
The reason for this is that trade jealousy, odium figulinum, which, in the case of men, does not go beyond the confines of their own particular pursuit, but with women, embraces the whole sex, since they have only one kind of business. Even when they meet in the street, women look at one another like gulfs and ghibellines, and it is a patent fact that when two women first make acquaintance with each other, they behave with more constraint and dissimulation than two men would show in a like case. And hence it is that an exchange of compliments between two women is a much more ridiculous proceeding than between two men. Further, whilst a man will, as a general rule, always preserve a certain amount of consideration and humanity in speaking to others,
Sorry, man.
even to those
That's
who are in
okay.
a very inferior position, it is intolerable to see how proudly and disdainfully a fine lady will generally behave towards
Want to
one
just take the one,
who
or
is
do
in
you
a
want to
lower
do two
social rank.
helicopters?
I do not mean a woman who is in her
Drop the
service
TV station?
whenever she speaks to her.
No, right here.
The reason of this may be that with women, differences of
Kinda
rank
easier.
are much more precarious
pick
than
it
with
up.
us, because
You do it.
while 100 considerations carry weight in our case, in theirs there is only
I
one,
think the one on the
namely,
right, D,
with
is
which
in,
man
like, the
they have found
farmland.
favor,
It
as
looks
also
pretty chill.
that they stand in much nearer relations with one another than men do, in consequence of the one-sided nature of their calling. This makes them endeavor to lay stress upon differences of rank. It is only the man whose intellect is clouded by his sexual impulses that could give the name of the fair sex to that
I didn't notice
undersized,
you jumped,
narrow-shouldered,
What?
broad-hipped, and
I
short-legged
didn't
race.
notice you jumped.
For the whole beauty of the sex is bound up with this impulse. Instead of calling them beautiful, there would be more warrant for describing women as the unaesthetic of sex. Neither for music, nor for poetry, nor for
that?
fine art have they really and truly any sense or susceptibility. It is a mere mockery if they make a pretense of it in order to assist their endeavor to please.
Yeah, I
How
know
did you
roughly
Hence-
where.
fucking thermal?
As a result of this,
Somewhere
they are
over there.
incapable of taking a purely objective interest in anything, and the reason of it seems to me to be as follows. A man tries to acquire direct mastery over things, either by understanding them, or by forcing them to do his will, but a woman is always and everywhere reduced to obtaining this mastery indirectly, namely through a man, and whatever direct mastery she may have is entirely confined to him. And so it lies in woman's nature to look upon everything only as a means for conquering man, and if she takes an interest in anything else, it is simulated, a mere roundabout way of gaining her ends by coquetry, and feigning what she does not feel. Hence, even Rousseau declared, women have in general no love for any art. They have no proper knowledge of any, and they have no genius.
I got eyes on you.
No one who
Scotty.
sees it all below the surface can have failed to remark the same thing. You need only observe the kind of attention women bestow upon a concert, an opera, or a play.
Grab that armor.
The childish simplicity, for example, with which they keep on chattering during the finest
I have a trophy
passages in the
system on
greatest
the Piranha helicopter.
masterpieces.
Yep.
If it is true that the Greeks excluded women from their theaters, they were
Go.
quite right in what they did. At any rate, you would have been able to hear what was said upon the stage.
Do we want to attempt a
In our
court?
day,
It looks like
besides,
no one-
or in lieu of saying,
no.
let
Yeah.
a woman keep silence
Yeah.
in the church,
Yeah, I don't mind that. Let's do downtown.
it would be much to the point
Downtown.
to say,
Getting some good
let a
gun
woman
fights there,
keep
too.
silence in the theater. This might perhaps be put up in big letters on the curtain. And you cannot expect anything else of women if you consider that the most distinguished intellects among the whole sex have never managed to produce a single achievement in the fine arts that is really great, genuine, and original, or given to the world any work of permanent value in any sphere.
Drop.
This is most strikingly shown in regard to painting, where mastery of technique is at least as much within their
Money
power
right
as
there,
within
if you wanna
ours,
grab that money.
Yeah,
and hence they are diligent in cultivating it, but still, they have not a single great painting to boast of, just because they are deficient in that objectivity of mind which is so directly indispensable in painting.
Well,
They never get beyond a subjective point of view.
Yeah.
It is quite in keeping with this that
You
ordinary
did.
women have no real susceptibility
fucking
for
killed me.
art at
Brady.
all. For nature
What do you
proceeds
want?
in
What do you
strict sequence, non facit saltum. And Duarte, in his Examen de Ingenios para las Ciencias, a book which has been famous for 300 years,
Thank you.
denies women the possession of all the higher faculties.
Yusuf over
fucking-
there.
Get him.
The case is not altered by particular and partial exceptions. Taken as a whole,
Christ.
women are and remain thoroughgoing Philistines,
All I want for
and
Christmas
quite
is a
incurable.
PS5, and that's it.
You need
Hence,
a gun?
with that absurd arrangement which allows them to share the rank and title of their husbands, they are a constant stimulus to his ignoble ambitions. And further, it is just because they are Philistines that modern society, where they take the lead and set the tone, is in such a bad way.
Right in that box.
Napoleon's saying that women have no rank should be adopted as the right standpoint in determining their position in society. And as regards their other qualities, Chamfort makes the very true remark: they are made to trade with our own weaknesses and our follies, but not with our reason. The sympathies that exist between them and men are skin deep only, and do not touch the mind, or the feelings, or the character. They form the sexus sequior, the second sex, inferior in every respect to the first. Their infirmities should be treated with consideration, but to show them great reverence is extremely ridiculous and lowers us in their eyes. when nature made two divisions of the human race, she did not draw the line exactly through the middle. These divisions are polar and opposed to each other, it is true, but the difference between them is not qualitative merely. It is also quantitative. This is just the view which the ancients took of woman, and the view which people in the East take now, and their judgment as to her proper position is much more correct than ours, without old French notions of gallantry or preposterous system of reverence, that highest product of Teutonico-Christian stupidity. These notions have served only to make women more arrogant and overbearing, so that one is occasionally reminded of the holy apes in Benares, who, in the consciousness of their sanctity and inviolable position, think they can do exactly as they please.
Someone else is here with me.
But in the West, the woman, and especially the lady, finds herself in a false position, for woman, rightly called by the ancients sexus sequior, is by no means fit to be the object of our honor and veneration, or to hold her head higher than man and be on equal terms with him. The consequences of this false position are sufficiently obvious. Accordingly, it would be a very desirable thing if this number 2 of the human race were in Europe also relegated to her natural place, and an end put to that lady nuisance, which not only moves all Asia to laughter, but would have been ridiculed by Greece and Rome as well.
I have no clue what that means. Like,
it is impossible to calculate the good effects which such a
that,
change
but I don't
would bring
understand
about
how
in our
to,
social,
like,
civil, and political arrangements.
It's like 3.
There would be no necessity for the Salic law. There would be a superfluous truism. In Europe, the lady, strictly so called, is a being who should not exist at all. She should be either a housewife or a girl who hopes to become one, and she should be brought up not to be arrogant, but to be thrifty and submissive. It is just because there are such people as ladies in Europe that the women of the lower classes, that is to say the great majority of the sex, are much more unhappy than they are in the East. And even Lord Byron says, "Thought of the state of women under the ancient Greeks, convenient enough. Present state, a remnant of the barbarism of the chivalric and the feudal ages, artificial and unnatural. They ought to mind home and be well fed and clothed, but not mixed in society, well educated too in religion, but to read neither poetry nor politics, nothing but books of piety and cookery. Music, drawing, dancing, also a little gardening and plowing now and then. I've seen them mending the roads in Epirus with good success. Why not, as well, haymaking and milking?" The laws of marriage prevailing in Europe consider the woman as the equivalent of the man. Start, that is to say, from a wrong position. In our part of the world where monogamy is the rule, to marry means to have one's rights and double one's duties. Now, when the laws gave women equal rights with man, they ought to have also endowed her with a masculine intellect.
That one too.
But the fact is that just in proportion as the honors and privileges which the laws accord to women exceed the amount which nature gives, is there a diminution in the number of women who really participate in these privileges, and all the remainder are deprived of their natural rights by just so much as is given to the others over and above their share. For the institution of monogamy and the laws of marriage which it entails bestow upon the woman an unnatural position of privilege by considering her throughout as the full equivalent of the man, which is by no means the case. And seeing this, men who are shrewd and prudent very often scruple to make so great a sacrifice and to acquiesce in so unfair an arrangement. Consequently, whilst among polygamous nations every woman is provided for, where monogamy prevails, the number of married women is limited, and there remains over a large number of women without stay or support, who in the upper classes vegetate as useless old maids, and in the lower succumb to hard work for which they are not suited. or else become fille de joie, whose
I'm just
life
gonna
is
take it,
as
but there's
destitute
nothing-
of joy as it is of honor. But under the circumstances they become a necessity, and their position is openly recognized as serving the special end of warding off temptation from those women favored by fate, who have found, or may hope to find, husbands.
Okay, want to try and do another
In
recon
London
on Boneyard,
alone
or
there are
just go
80,000 prostitutes. What are they
Might as
but the
well.
women who, under the institution of monogamy, have come off worse?
We'll see how it's looking.
Theirs is a dreadful fate. They are human sacrifices offered up on the altar of monogamy. The women whose wretched position is here described are the inevitable set-off to the European lady with her arrogance and pretension. Polygamy is therefore a real benefit to the female sex, if it is taken as a whole. And from another point of view, there is no true reason why a man whose wife suffers from chronic illness or remains barren, or has gradually become too old for him, should not take a second.
Legendary crate.
The motives which induce so many people to become converts to Mormonism appear to be just those which militate against the unnatural institution of monogamy. Translator's
Cars
note.
pulling up.
The Mormons have
No.
recently given up polygamy and received the American franchise in its stead. End note. Moreover, the bestowal of unnatural rights upon women has imposed upon them unnatural duties, and, nevertheless,
Alright,
a
coming.
breach of these duties makes them unhappy. Let me explain. A man may often think that his social or financial position will suffer if he marries,
Yeah.
unless he makes some brilliant alliance. His desire will then be to win a woman of his own choice under conditions other than those of marriage,
Okay, jumping.
such as will secure her position and that of the children. However fair, reasonable, fit, and proper these conditions may be, and the woman consents by foregoing that undue amount of privilege which marriage alone can bestow, she
I'm
to
being
some
shot
extent
from the roof.
loses
I'm
her
being shot from
honor,
the other side of the roof.
because marriage is the basis
So
of civic
exactly
society,
southeast.
and she will lead an unhappy life, since human nature is so constituted that we pay an attention to the opinion of other people which is out of all proportion to its value. On the other hand, if she does not consent, she runs the risk either of having to be given in marriage to a man whom she does not like, or of being landed high and dry as an old maid.
Run away.
For the period during which she has a chance of being settled for life is very short. And in view of this aspect of the institution of monogamy, Thomasius's profoundly
peeked out.
learned treatise De Concubinatu is well worth reading,
Okay.
for it shows
Yeah,
that,
right here, I got
amongst
mine.
all nations and in all ages down
I
to
got
the
stuck
Lutheran
underneath
Reformation, concubinage was permitted, nay, that it was an institution which was to a certain extent actually recognized by law and attended with no dishonor.
I got guys.
It was only the Lutheran Reformation that degraded it
I
from
got
its
eyes on the
position.
door.
It was seen to be a further justification for the marriage of the clergy. And then, after that, the Catholic Church did not dare to remain behindhand in the matter. There is no use arguing about polygamy. It must be taken as de facto existing everywhere, and the only question is as to how it shall be regulated.
Yeah, there's some bunch behind you.
Where are there, then, any real monogamists? We all live, at any rate for a time,
What else
and
is
most
standing
of
up
us
there?
always, in polygamy.
You got one more armor
And
post,
so,
or did you grab a satchel,
since
or-
every man needs many women, there's nothing fairer than to
Are you
allow
guys still on
him,
the
nay,
roof?
to make it
Yeah.
incumbent upon him, to provide for many women.
Check out this little corner.
This
right
will
here.
reduce
It's actually
woman
could be
to
one.
her true and natural position as a subordinate being, and the lady, that monster of European civilization and Teutonico-Christian
Oh
stupidity,
yeah, looks good.
will disappear from the world, leaving only women, but no more unhappy women, of which Europe is now full. In India, no woman is ever independent, but in accordance with the law of Mamu, she stands under the control of her father, her husband, her brother, or her son. It is, to be sure, a revolting thing that a widow should immolate herself upon her husband's funeral pyre, but it is also revolting that she should spend her husband's money with her paramours, the money for which he toiled his whole life long in the consoling belief that he was providing for his children. Happy are those who have kept the middle course, medium tenuere beati. The first love of a mother for her child is, with the lower animals as with men, of a purely instinctive character, and so it ceases when the child is no longer in a physically helpless condition.
No.
After that, the first love should give way to one that is based on habit and reason, but this often fails to make its appearance, especially where the mother did not love the father. The love of a father for his child is of a different order and more likely to last, because it has its foundation in the fact that in the child he recognizes his own inner self. That is to say, his love for it is metaphysical in origin. In almost all nations, whether of the ancient or the modern world, even amongst the Hottentots, property is inherited by the male descendants alone. It is only in Europe that a departure has taken place, but not amongst the nobility, however. That the property which has cost men long years of toil and effort, and been won with so much difficulty, should afterwards come into the hands of women, who then, in their lack of reason, squander it in a short time or otherwise fool it away, is a grievance and a wrong as serious as it is common, which should be prevented by limiting the right of women to inherit. In my opinion, the best arrangement would be that by which women, whether widows or daughters, should never receive anything beyond the interest of life on property secured by mortgage, and in no case the property itself or the capital, except where all male descendants fail. The people who make money are men, not women, and it follows from this that women are neither justified in having unconditional possession of it, nor fit persons to be entrusted with its administration. When wealth, in any true sense of the word, that is to say funds, houses, or land, is to go to them as an inheritance, they should never be allowed the free disposition of it. In their case, a guardian should always be appointed, and hence they should never be given the free control of their children, whenever it can be avoided. The vanity of women, even though it should not prove to be greater than that of men, has this much danger in it, that it takes an entirely material direction. They are vain, I mean, of their personal beauty, and then of finery, show, and magnificence. That is just why they are so much in their element in society. It is this, too, which makes them so inclined to be extravagant, all the more as their reasoning power is low. Accordingly, we find an ancient writer describing woman as, in general, of an extravagant nature. Gune to synolon esti paneron physi. But with men, vanity often takes the direction of non-material advantages, such as intellect, learning, courage. In the Politics, Aristotle explains the great disadvantage which accrued to the Spartans from the fact that they conceded too much power to their women by giving them the right of inheritance and dower, and a great amount of independence. And he shows how much this contributed to Sparta's fall.
Might have been those same guys that were over there.
May it not be the case in France that the influence of women, which went on increasing steadily from the time of Louis XIII, was to blame for that gradual corruption of the court and the government which brought about the Revolution of 1789, of which all subsequent disturbances have been the fruit. However that may be, the false position which women occupy, demonstrated as it is in the most glaring way by the institution of the lady, is a fundamental defect in our social scheme, and this defect, proceeding from the very heart of it, must spread its baneful influence in all directions. That woman is by nature meant to obey may be seen by the fact that every woman who is placed in the unnatural position of complete independence immediately attaches herself to some man by whom she allows herself to be guided and ruled. It is because she needs a lord and master. If she is young, it will be a lover.
15.1.
If she is old,
three guys,
a priest.
like, right all around us.
Kant wrote a treatise on the vital powers.
That area thought.
I should prefer to write a dirge for them. The superabundant display of vitality, which takes the form of knocking, hammering, and tumbling things about, has proved a daily torment to me all my life long. There are people, it is true, nay, a great many people, who smile at such things because they are not sensitive to noise. But they are just the people who are also not sensitive to argument, or thought, or poetry, or art. In a word, to any kind of intellectual influence.
Better decide left or right.
The reason of it
let's
is
go
that the
right.
tissue of their brains
Okay.
is of a very rough and coarse quality. On the other hand, noise is a torture to intellectual people. In the biographies of almost all great writers, or wherever else their personal utterances are recorded, I find complaints about it. In the case of Kant, for instance, Goethe, Lichtenberg, Jean Paul. And if it should happen that any writer has omitted to express himself on the matter, it is only for want of an opportunity. This aversion to noise I should explain as follows. If you cut up a large diamond into little bits, it will entirely lose the value it had as a whole, and an army, divided up into small bodies of soldiers, loses all its strength. So, a great intellect sinks to the level of an ordinary one. As soon as it is interrupted and disturbed,
Like military?
its attention
Yeah.
distracted and drawn off from the matter in hand.
One recon
For its
there.
superiority depends upon its power of
No
concentration,
scavenger, but that's fine.
of bringing all its strength to bear
Unless
upon
one of us
one
wants to
theme,
land up
Keep an
there.
eye and see
the
if I
same
can
way as a
see
concave
Yeah, let's go
mirror
for that.
collects into one point
Alright.
all the rays of light that strike upon
Somebody
it.
somebody land for the heli,
Noisy
and I'll go
interruption
with the scav, please. Okay.
is a hindrance to this
Yeah, someone we should wait
concentration.
for this, yes.
Alright, cool.
Go for the
That
heli.
is why distinguished minds have always shown such an extreme
You don't
dislike
even
to
ignore
disturbance
my
in any
pain
form,
completely.
as something that breaks in upon and distracts their
I was
thoughts.
gonna get the second heli, but it's not gonna.
Above all, have
That's
they
right.
been averse to that violent interruption which comes from noise.
Do you stay up in the
Ordinary
air? I'll
people
grab
are
this
not
and
much
then
put out by anything
Yeah,
of the
that was
sort.
the plan.
Oh, yeah, we're getting
The most
scavs?
sensible and
Yeah.
intelligent of
Yeah.
all nations in Europe lays down the rule,
Starter scav,
never
buy a loadout,
interrupt,
nothing better.
as the 11th commandment.
Yeah.
Noise is the most
Come on.
impertinent of all forms of interruption.
Alright, drop in on.
It is not only an interruption, but also a disruption of thought. Of course, where there's nothing to interrupt, noise will not be so particularly painful. Occasionally it happens that some slight but constant noise continues to bother and distract me for a time before I become distinctly conscious of it. All I feel is a steady increase in the labor of thinking, just as though I were trying to walk with a weight on my foot.
Beautiful.
At last I find out what it is. Let me now, however, pass from genus to
Here I come.
species.
Ready, D?
The most inexcusable and
Thank you, sir.
disgraceful of all noises is the cracking of whips, a truly infernal thing when it is done in the narrow, resounding streets of a town.
Meet you there, Ash.
I denounce it as making a peaceful life impossible. It puts an end to all quiet thought. That this cracking of whips should be allowed at all seems to me to show in the clearest way how senseless and thoughtless is the nature of mankind. No one with anything like an idea in his head can avoid a feeling
actually,
of actual pain
like
at
this,
this sudden sharp crack which paralyzes the brain, rends the
sniper.
thread of reflection,
I had a
murders thought. Every time this noise is made, it must disturb 100 people who are applying their minds to business of some sort,
Buy station
no
right.
matter
Buy
how
station right in
trivial
front
it
of
may
us.
be,
Yeah.
Where?
while on the thinker its effect
Literally
is
right here.
woeful and disastrous, cutting his thoughts asunder, much as the executioner's axe severs the head from the body.
One's gonna be spicy in about a minute.
No sound, be
you
it
got
ever
it?
so shrill,
Oh, shit.
cuts so
You,
sharply into the
actually,
brain
yeah.
as this cursed
There you go.
cracking of whips. You feel the sting of the lash right inside your head, and it affects the brain in the same way as touch affects a sensitive plant, and for the same length of time.
What do you guys want to do? You guys want to
With all due respect for the most
Yeah, I will.
holy
I'm going
doctrine
to
of
fire
utility,
the weapon right there.
I really cannot see why a fellow who is taking away a wagon load of gravel or dung should thereby obtain the right to kill in the bud the thoughts which may happen to be springing up
rest of
in
recon.
10,000 heads.
Alright, I also am holding an
The number
RPG
he will
now because I
disturb,
think that's
one after
pretty
another, in
valuable,
half an
so-
hour's drive through the town.
Yeah.
Okay, are we going
Hammering,
to quarry?
barking of dogs, and the crying of
Yep.
children are horrible to bear. But your only genuine assassin of
not?
thought is the
How
crack
are we
of a
doing
whip.
with the gas?
It exists for the purpose of destroying
Just
every
yeah,
pleasant
we'll be
moment
alright.
of quiet
Just
thought
everything.
that anyone may now and then enjoy.
More rookie
If
moves.
the driver had no
What did you
other
say
way of
that?
urging on his horse than by making this most abominable of all noises, it would be excusable. But quite the contrary is the case. This cursed cracking of whips is not only unnecessary but even useless. Its aim is to produce an effect upon the intelligence of the horse,
I just saw red.
and through the
dots.
constant abuse of it, the animal becomes habituated to the sound, which falls upon blunted
we're
feelings and produces no effect at all. The horse does
I don't
not
have
go
any
any faster for it. You'll have a remarkable example of this in the ceaseless cracking of his
Stay
whip
up
on the
for
part
this.
of a cab driver, while he is proceeding at a slow pace on the lookout for a fare. If he were to give his horse the slightest touch with the whip, it would have much more effect.
Y'all wanna
Supposing,
keep on
however,
ripping recons?
that it were absolutely necessary to crack the whip in order to keep the horse constantly in mind of its presence,
Okay, I'm
it would be
outside
enough
here
to
on
make the
ground.
100th part of the noise. For it is a well-known fact that, in regard to sight and hearing, animals are sensitive to
What,
even the
lumber maybe?
faintest
That one
indications.
seems like it's outside.
They are alive to
Yeah,
things
I like
that we
Oh,
can
shit.
scarcely
How do I
perceive.
get out of this
Need one
building?
more.
The most surprising instances of this are furnished by trained dogs and canary birds.
I don't know how to get out of
It
here.
is obvious,
Yeah.
therefore, that here we have
Sorry,
to
I
do
got
with an
lost.
act
My
of
bad.
pure wantonness, nay, with an
Oh, good. Lumber will
impudent
bring us into
defiance
the
offered
zone.
to those members of the community who may work with their heads by those who work with their hands. That such infamy should be tolerated in a town is a piece of barbarity and
We'll be good.
iniquity,
It's not
All
a
the
hard one
more.
to get to.
as it could easily be remedied by a police notice to the effect that every lash shall have a knot at the end of it. There can be no harm in drawing the attention of the mob to the fact that the classes above them work with their heads, for any kind of headwork is mortal anguish to the man in the street. A fellow who rides through the narrow alleys of a populous town with unemployed post horses or cart
Okay.
horses and keeps on cracking a whip several yards long with all his might
Perfect, that's good for us.
deserves
Let's go.
there and then to stand down and receive 5 really good blows with a stick.
Definitely some gunfire over to our left. Though, like over
All the
there.
philanthropists in the world,
Not sure
and
if
all
that's
the
the exact
legislators,
location, but-
meeting to advocate and decree the total abolition of
Dropping.
corporal punishment, will never persuade me to the contrary. There is something
What is
even
that?
more disgraceful than what I have just mentioned.
Most wanted. Fuck that shit.
Often enough, you may see a carter walking along the street, quite alone, without any horses, and still cracking away incessantly.
Or RPG.
So
yeah.
accustomed has
Yeah,
the wretch
it's
become
okay.
to it
Someone's
in
coming up behind
consequence
us,
of the
eh?
unwarrantable toleration
where
of
it
this
is.
practice.
Go at him.
Well,
A man's body and the needs of his body are now everywhere treated
Let's do these two.
with
Let's do these
tender
two.
indulgence.
yeah.
Is the thinking mind,
Yeah, I
then,
gotta
to be
stay
the
low
only
just
thing
for a
that is
minute.
never to obtain the slightest measure of
Yep.
consideration or protection, to say nothing of respect?
Alright, now we're
Carters,
Good
porters,
looks,
messengers,
good looks, Scotty.
these are the
Yeah,
beasts
there's
of
the one right
burden
below
among
us.
mankind.
Like that, I think.
By all means,
Yeah, no,
let them
let's-
be treated justly,
I like
fairly,
this as an
indulgently,
idea.
and
Yeah.
with forethought.
Yeah, the other one's on the crane. I
But they
think.
must not be permitted to stand in the
The
way
other
of the
one's
higher
definitely on
endeavors
the
of
crane
humanity by
over there.
wantonly making a noise. How many great and splendid thoughts, I should like to know,
Rise up a little bit,
have been
Scotty.
lost to the world
Oh,
by the
okay.
crack of a whip?
Dropping.
If I had the upper hand, I should soon produce in the heads of these people an indissoluble association of ideas
I
between
think
cracking a
that's
whip and getting a whipping.
Y'all want to hit this too?
Let us hope that the more
Pretty
intelligent
there.
and refined among the nations will make
Yes
a
or no?
beginning in this matter,
I'm gonna jump and hit it.
and then that the Germans
Okay.
may
Yes,
take
we're all
example
going.
by it and follow suit. Meanwhile,
Quick.
I may quote what Thomas Hood says
I
of them.
don't know if I need it.
For a musical
yeah,
nation,
I'm not kidding.
they are the most
Gotta go if you need
noisy
it.
I ever met with.
Nope. Nope, I already got mine.
Alright,
that
I'm
they
gonna
are
go
so
and put
is
to
due
this
to
new
the
one, okay,
fact,
please?
not that they are more fond of making a noise than other people. They would
Lot of
deny
action
if
to the
you asked
right.
them. But that
Yeah,
their
look, I'll stay
senses
in
are
that shit.
obtuse.
Get this done quick,
Consequently,
man.
when they hear a noise, it does not affect them much. It does not disturb them in reading or thinking, simply because they do not think. They only smoke, which is their substitute for thought.
Alright, let's
The
go.
general toleration of
wanna pick
unnecessary
this one back
noise,
up
the
back
slamming
here?
of doors, for instance,
Might as
a
well.
very unmannerly and ill-bred thing, is direct evidence
I'll drop.
that the prevailing habit of mind is dullness and lack of thought. In Germany, it seems as though care were taken that no one should ever think for mere noise. To mention one form of it, the way in which drumming goes on for no purpose at all. Finally,
Go.
as regards the literature of the subject treated of in this chapter, I have only
You
one
can't
work
go
to
that way,
recommend.
remember? You can't go that
but
way,
it
remember?
is a good one.
Oh, well, actually, no, you can.
I refer
Okay.
to a poetical
Kind
epistle
of. I cut the line
in
as
Terzo
close as you
Rimo
can.
by the famous painter
Get on Harper,
Bronzino,
put it up there.
entitled De Romori,
Okay, I'm gonna circle.
a Messer Luca
Yep.
Martini. It gives a detailed
Oh,
description
fucking
of the
retarded.
torture
Yo,
to
also,
which people are
this is
put
perfect.
by
We
the
gotta buy
various
this right here.
noises of a small
Yeah.
Italian town. Written in a
Your
tragic
gas
comic
mask and
style,
shit.
it is very amusing. The epistle may be found in Opere Bellesche del Berni, Aretino ed Altri, Volume 2, page 258, apparently published in Utrecht in 1771. In a field of
Are you guys all
ripening
buying UAVs?
corn,
I'm gonna buy
I came to a place
Yeah.
which had been trampled down by some
buy
ruthless
ammunition?
foot, and as I
Yes,
glanced
yes,
among the
let's buy
countless
that.
stalks,
You got it?
I got
every one of them alike, standing there
Okay,
so
hold on.
erect and
Hold on.
bearing
Hold
the
on.
full weight of the
Yo, I
ear,
can
I'll buy it.
buy something
saw a
else, too, if
multitude
you
of
guys
different
want. I don't
flowers,
know if you-
red and blue and violet.
Oh, fuck.
How pretty they looked,
Fuck.
as they grew there so naturally
Yo,
with
buy
their
an
little
armor
foliage.
box, maybe.
But, thought
I'll
I,
pick it up. I
Armor
fucked
box
up. I bought
you
an
they
armor.
are quite useless.
Yeah, I bought an armor.
They bear no fruit. They are mere
Okay,
weeds,
we're beating
I already
suffered
got
to
one, I already
remain,
got one, I already
only
got
because
one.
there's
I'm getting
no
a
getting rid of
fucking
them.
UAV and let's get it.
Oh.
And yet,
I meant hold
but
on to
for
that,
these
though.
flowers,
Oh, fuck.
there would
I
be
didn't
nothing
have
to
any
charm
armor
the
left,
eye
so-
in that wilderness of stalks. They are emblematic of poetry and art,
Okay, where are we
which,
going?
in civic life, so severe, still
We're
useful,
and then we're gonna
not
take
without
that
its
building
fruit,
over too, because it's in the
play the
zone.
same
wanna take
part
the purple
as
building?
flowers in the corn.
Yeah. Anyone on there?
We're doing that one.
There
now?
are some really beautiful
Get that
landscapes in the world.
Since we don't
The
have
human
that
figures in them are
precision
poor,
recon, let's do this.
and you would not better
Should I
look
hit
at
this
them.
UAV? What do you think?
Sure.
The fly should be used as the symbol of
Oh, actually,
impertinence and
extremely good.
audacity, for whilst all
we're
other animals
decently
shun
good.
man
There's a dude
more
right
than
beside that
anything
recon.
else, and
Yeah,
run
but
away
that dude is
even before he comes near them.
easy for us.
The fly
Child's play.
bites upon his very nose.
Then we also got guys on. in this
Two
whole house,
Chinamen
but we're
I'm not
gonna-
traveling in Europe
got one
went to
guy
the
here.
theater for the
Might be-
first
Might be a
time.
couple dudes.
One of them did
You want a
nothing
hot
but
dog?
study the machinery,
Go get hot dog.
and he succeeded in finding out how it was worked.
Probably.
The other tried to get at the
Fancy
meaning of the
French,
piece in spite of his ignorance of the language. Here,
Right,
you
there's
have
a-
the astronomer
there's a lot
and the
of,
philosopher.
Building across from us.
Yes, I know. Get out.
Wisdom,
Where the chopper
which
at?
is
Drop
only
the-
theoretical and never put into practice,
Dropping the chopper
is
on
like a double rose. Its
Got
color
it.
and perfume are
the
delightful,
fucker.
but it withers away and leaves no seed.
Also, watch that car there.
No rose
Oh,
without a
down.
thorn. Yes, but many a thorn without a rose.
How many guys are in here? Do we know?
Oh no, someone just got revived though.
Oh,
A wide-spreading apple tree stood
On
in
the
full
roof.
bloom. and behind it,
Down.
a straight
You hit
fur
me again.
raised its dark and
Oh,
tapering
wait, you revived
head.
yourself there, Scotty?
Yeah, not anymore
Look
though.
at the
He took me
thousands
down
of
again
gay
once I
blossoms
got up.
which cover me everywhere, said the apple tree.
Oh, where the
What
fuck
have
is
you
that?
to show in
Hit the
comparison?
Behind.
Scotty, come around,
Dark
come around,
green
come around,
needles.
come around.
That is true,
I think that's how
replied
he's
the
gonna
fir.
kill me. I can see
But
him.
when winter comes, you will be bared of your glory,
Oh, there's two.
and I shall be as I am now.
Where?
Where are they?
I clicked on it.
Once, as I was botanizing under an oak, I found amongst a number of other plants of similar height, one that was dark in color,
I
with
think
tightly
I'm over
closed
with the
leaves,
poet, man. I'm just
and a
chilling.
stalk that was straight
I don't know
and
what's
stiff.
going on.
When I touched it, it said to me in firm tones, "Let me alone. I am
Can you
not for
hold
your
this
collection,
house down so
like
Scotty
these
can come
plants
back
to which
here?
nature has given
let's
only
do
a
that,
single
bro.
year of
Yeah.
life.
I'm not.
I am a little
But we
oak."
need to get Scotty back on this.
So it is with a man whose influence is to last hundreds of years, as a child, as a youth, often even as a full-grown man, nay, his whole life long. He goes about among his fellows,
For that right now.
Yeah,
looking
we do.
like
We have
them,
enough money.
and seemingly as
No, just split.
unimportant.
Yeah, just split, but not to
But
get
let
the
him
first
alone.
solo.
He will
Hush
not
does.
die.
I'm a go.
Time will come and bring those who know how to
Hey,
value
those
him.
guys that were sniping were in that building.
This building?
Two of
The
them.
man who goes
Two
up
of
in a
them, the one
balloon
that I clicked
does
on
not
that's
feel
blue.
as though he were
What's
ascending.
the plan? You're going solo?
He only sees
You're
the
going solo
earth
with the buyback?
sinking deeper under
Yep.
him.
But yo, we should all meet at that tall
There
building
is a mystery,
on purple.
which only those will understand who feel the
Car
truth of
just
it.
stopped. Car just
Yeah, I
stopped
saw
at that
that.
one, Adam.
I saw that.
Maybe you should
Your
go around to
estimation
that
of a
one.
man's size will be affected by the distance at which you stand from him, but in two
he's buying all these
entirely
toys back
opposite
there.
ways, according as it is his physical or his mental stature that you are considering.
Going to the purple building.
The one will seem smaller the farther off you move, the other greater. Nature covers all her works with a varnish of beauty, like the tender bloom that is breathed, as it were, on the surface of a peach or plum. Painters and poets lay themselves out to take off this varnish, to store it up,
Yes, sir.
and give it to us to be
There's a
enjoyed
dude
at
come
our
in
leisure.
around this side.
We drink deep of this beauty, long
So what-
before we enter upon life itself, and when afterwards we come to see the works of nature for ourselves, the varnish is gone,
That's in that building.
the artists
Am I
have
good to go in
used it
that
up,
building or no?
and we have enjoyed it
The
in
one I'm
advance.
at, I haven't seen anyone yet. I've just been
Thus it
creeping around the
is
first floor.
that the world so often appears harsh and devoid of charm, nay, actually repulsive. It were better to leave us to discover the varnish for ourselves. This would mean that we should not enjoy it all at once and in large quantities. We should have no finished pictures, no perfect poems,
Down to that after.
but we should look at all things in that genial and pleasing light
This side's looking like
in which,
everything
even
leaving.
now, a child of nature sometimes
That
sees them.
LMG's upstairs. Oh, there it is.
Someone
Hit the
who has not
LMG down the main
anticipated
floor.
his aesthetic
Yeah, I got
pleasures by the help
I'm
of
picking up
art,
that armor.
Got
or
a
taken the
C4
charms of
there,
life
too.
too early. The cathedral in Mayence is so shut in by the houses that are built round about it that there is no one spot from which you can see it as a whole. This is symbolic of everything great or beautiful in the world. It ought to exist for its own sake alone, but before very long it is misused to serve alien ends. People come from all directions wanting to find in it
Are you on the
support
roof already,
and
Adam?
maintenance for themselves. They stand in the way
But
and spoil
does this
its
group have
effects.
a,
To be sure,
no, it doesn't.
there is
Can't
nothing
get up on
surprising in
without
this,
coming to the
for in a
stairs.
world of need and
I rigged the back
imperfection,
door there.
everything
Unless
is
you wanna rig
seized upon which can be used to satisfy want. Nothing is exempt from this service, no, not even those very things which arise only
Oh, shit, we
when
got a
need and
sniper
want
on,
are for a moment lost sight of,
over
the
there
beautiful
somewhere.
and the
Yeah.
true,
The red
sought
building?
Yeah.
for their own sakes. This is especially
Maybe
illustrated and
three.
corroborated in
But
the
yo,
case of
don't engage them, man. They're
institutions,
gonna
whether
fucking have to
Yeah,
great
no,
or
I'm
small,
getting it.
wealthy or
I'm
poor,
just gonna lay
founded,
down and shit.
no matter in
Well,
what
for
century
fuck's
or in
sakes.
what land. to maintain and
He
advance
wasn't.
human
I didn't
knowledge,
even do anything. I just
generally,
turned the corner.
to afford help to those intellectual
Yeah,
efforts
that was a
which
thing.
ennoble the race. Wherever these institutions may be, it is not long
They're gonna have
before
to jump
people
off on the
sneak
next
up to
circle
them
anyway,
under
so-
the pretense of
I
wishing
don't
to
think anyone can
further
jump on
those
the-
special
fuck.
ends,
Yo, should I
Are all you
position them?
guys upstairs?
while they are really
Yeah.
led on by the desire to secure the emoluments which have been left for their
That you?
furtherance,
Boys,
Oh,
yo,
yeah.
get ready now,
And
get ready
thus-
now.
to satisfy certain
Come up and
coarse
get your guns
and
out.
brutal instincts of their own.
Someone's
Thus it
downstairs.
is that we come to have so many charlatans in every
Pop up
branch of
again.
knowledge.
Right, yeah, right there.
The charlatan takes very different shapes according to circumstances. But at bottom,
shit.
he is a man who cares nothing about knowledge for its own sake, and only strives to gain the semblance of it, that he may use it for his own personal ends, which are always
Oh, they got me
selfish
from behind too. We
and
got
material.
fuck there, man.
Holy shit!
Every hero is a Samson.
Ow. Okay, Alex.
The strong man
him, Alex?
succumbs to the intrigues
Yeah,
of
Came
the
up
weak
that back stairwell, you
and
got
the many.
I got
And
two
if,
of them.
in the end, he loses all patience, he crushes both them and himself. Or he is like Gulliver at Lilliput, overwhelmed by an enormous number of little men. A mother gave her children Aesop's fables to read in the hope of educating
Alright, let's buy
and
us
improving
back.
their minds.
Right
Yeah.
here.
But they very soon brought the book back, and the eldest,
You can take that whip
wise
too.
beyond his years, delivered himself as follows. This is no book for us. It's much too childish and stupid. You can't make us believe that foxes and wolves and ravens are able to talk. We've got beyond stories of that kind.
There's several dudes in this building.
In these
so
young
just be aware.
hopefuls, you have the enlightened
In our building?
rationalists of the
Yeah.
future.
According to
Yeah,
this
they're coming
UAV,
up
at
the
least.
other side.
A number of
What's around my door?
porcupines huddled together for warmth on a cold day in winter. But, as they began to prick one another with their quills, they were obliged to disperse. However, the cold drove them together again, when just the same thing happened. At last, after many turns of huddling and dispersing, they discovered that they would be best off by remaining a little distance from one another. In the same way, the need of society drives the human porcupines together, only to be mutually repelled by the many prickly,
Yeah, do you watch your
disagreeable
side, huh?
qualities
Yeah.
of their nature. The moderate distance, which they at last discovered
Yes,
to be
sir.
the only tolerable condition of intercourse, is the code of politeness and fine manners. And those who transgress it are roughly told, in the English phrase, to keep their distance.
Another guy.
By this arrangement, the mutual need of warmth is only very moderately satisfied. But
Okay.
then, people do not
There's
get
that vehicle.
pricked.
There's a bunch of guys over there.
A man who has some heat in himself prefers to remain outside,
Okay, I'm gonna
worry
go.
where he will neither prick other people nor get pricked himself.
Under.
Yep.
Get in, get in.
Don't go down on the. Oh, they fucking did a good trick. They're on my side, underneath. So don't go
Oh,
down.
they're on one guy on my side too. Just fucking literally, Scotty. He's laying on the ground. Watch out! I didn't even get a piece of him.
I didn't
Literally
either.
been laying there. Fuck, with my gun. What a fucking bitch.
Don't go downstairs, Scotty.
See that?
Was that not a guy right there?
Yeah, there
Yep.
was a guy right there in the doorway.
Love it again.